la nostra discussione, il nostro dibattito di stamani. Il tema è sempre cosmopolitismo e comunità, dove di nuovo al centro, credo almeno stamani, quello che è messo al centro sono le nuove forme sono le questioni sulla sovranità, chi è il sovrano veramente, e il rapporto tra la cittadinanza e il territorio e varie forme di cittadinanza e varie forme di autodeterminazione collettiva, ovviamente, autonomia di sovranità e anche appunto la questione stessa della sovranità, se la sovranità debba coincidere per forza con i confini nazionali, con lo Stato nazionale, eccetera, eccetera. E oggi pomeriggio io immagino che avremo molto a che fare anche con questioni di disuguaglianze e di genere, e disuguaglianze sia economiche che questioni di appartenenza e di genere. E quindi io cominciamo con la Hippie insegna da London School of Economics, non sbaglio, ha studiato a Roma, si è laureata alla Sapienza a Roma e ci parlerà di migrazioni e cittadinanza nello Stato capitalista.
Grazie dell'invito, grazie di essere qui. Sono molto contenta di essere in Italia e di parlare del tema cittadinanza e Stato. L'Italia è un po' il mio secondo paese perché appunto, nonostante io sia albanese, ho studiato qui. E il mio intervento però sarà in inglese perché è stato scritto in inglese, però sarei molto contenta dopo di ricevere domande in italiano e in inglese come preferite. My topic is citizenship in the capitalist state, and my attempt is to articulate 11 theses on the theme of citizenship and to think about transformations of citizenship in the light of the constraints that capitalism poses to democracy. So I will simply say what my 11 theses are and leave the rest for discussion. The thesis emerged out of analysis of citizenship in the light of the way in which citizenship is extended to migrants, where two trends stand out in the contemporary capitalist state. The first one is the trend that concerns the position of the super rich, for whom it's become increasingly easy to acquire citizenship in the countries that they choose to adopt as their own. For anyone who belongs to the super rich category, from property investors to real estate managers to business people, anyone who can prove that they have the ability to make an investment, productive investment in the whole society, typically face accelerated procedures for naturalization, for becoming permanent citizens and for becoming permanent residents and eventually citizens. So anyone who is willing to pay a substantial fee and to prove that they can make a productive contribution to the whole society has a much easier time naturalizing compared to any other incoming migrant. This you can see at every stage of the naturalization process. In the United Kingdom, for a fee of about £10,000, you can apply for the super premium service for naturalization and the acquisition of permanent leave to remain, and that means that you are faced with much less waiting time. For example, every bureaucratic procedure, the way in which digital fingerprints are collected, officials from the Home Office can come to your house and collect your biodata. Accelerated procedures at every level are the way in which the super rich are reasoned their way into the whole society. So the first trend is one in which it's increasingly easy for those who apply under these particular tiers of visa, tier 1 visa in the United Kingdom, freedom, or in the United States there's something equivalent. In Australia, Canada, this is a trend, a dominant trend across Western European states. The other trend concerns the poor. And for those, on the other hand, it's become increasingly difficult to be naturalized. They have to pay waiting fees, they have to apply and have waiting times that are significantly shorter than for the super rich. They have to meet minimum requirements. These requirements have to do with income, for example, so you have to show that you earn more than a certain amount, or that you are able to sustain your family beyond a certain threshold in order to become a citizen. But there are also civic and linguistic hurdles that the poor need to overcome. They have to pass linguistic tests, or they have to pass civic integration tests to show that they are worthy citizens of the host society, worthy would-be citizens of the host society. So citizenship, in the light of these two trends, and this is my first thesis, in the light of how easy it is for the super rich and how much difficult it is for the poor to acquire citizenship in a host state, has become exclusionary and exclusive. My second thesis is that in the light of this, citizenship has lost its emancipatory value. And the main problem with the contemporary discussion around these trends is the acquiescence with this kind of view of citizenship that sees it as a good that can be bought, sold, and exchanged for money. This picture of citizenship as a good that can be bought, sold, and exchanged remains unchallenged even by people who are typically critical of the state's right to control its borders and to exclude migrants at the border. The debate is often polarized, as we have seen this morning, between cosmopolitans who are in favor of open borders on the one hand, and communitarians who are against open borders on the other hand. And on both sides of this debate, when it comes to thinking about the modalities through which citizenship is extended to new members of society, the trend that sees citizenship as conditional on overcoming linguistic and civic barriers is very much unchallenged. Yet, it seems to me that even though both cosmopolitans and communitarians seem to agree that it's plausible to ask would-be immigrants or would-be citizens, immigrants who live in society, to make a productive contribution, to show that they have earned their citizenship, this undermines a different interpretation of what citizenship is about. In this different interpretation, citizenship has emancipatory value. It is an alternative interpretation that emphasizes how citizenship is a process-oriented understanding of what it is to be a political member of a society. It's an activist account of citizenship that sees the acquisition of citizenship and the bundle of rights and responsibilities that come with citizenship as a vehicle of political emancipation. So the more we emphasize citizenship as a good that can be bought, sold, or exchanged against certain competences that migrants have to have, the more we undermine this alternative understanding of citizenship as a political process through which we expand the political membership of political community, and through which this membership acquires emancipatory value, through which the exercise of political rights becomes emancipatory. My third thesis is that citizenship consolidates the class character of the state. To say that the state has a class character is pretty much the same as saying that the state's ability to act as a political platform through which conflicts between social groups are balanced and mediated in a fair way, for example through democratic means, is progressively eroded. So, when the state has a class character, the state becomes an instrument that serves the interests of powerful citizens, of powerful elites on the one hand, or that undermines the interests of the more vulnerable citizens. So the super rich can now use their money and status to acquire citizenship, and they can be rewarded if they do this. And on the other hand, the poor and those who don't have the money and the means, both educational and financial, who don't pass, for example, the civic integration test, the more vulnerable member of society can be punished. So again, the super rich are rewarded and the poor are punished, and this shows us that the contemporary state has a class character. My fourth thesis connected to that is that we no longer live, if we ever did, in democracies, but in oligarchies. And here I have in mind the classical distinction in ancient political thought of democracy as the rule of the many and oligarchy as the rule by the few who have money, wealth, and power. When citizenship is bought and sold, instead of being a vehicle of political emancipation, it becomes a tool of domination and oppression. And democracy as the ideal through which members of a political community take turns in ruling and being ruled is progressively undermined and turns into a form of oligarchy through which a rich minority controls political power and appropriates the means through which one can access and exercise political power. My fifth thesis is that the market controls the state and not the other way around. And again here, instead of being a tool through which to temper the excesses of markets and to assert the priority of democratic decision-making, when citizenship is bought and sold, it turns into a commodity like all other commodities in the market. Instead of being used to tame capitalist market power, the state surrenders before it. My sixth thesis is that citizenship used to depend on money and property qualifications, and that it still does. So citizenship can be easily sold to the rich and has to be paid for by the poor. And the cost is not negligible. In fact, one of the concessions that the UK government made to members of the so-called Windrush generation in the recent Windrush scandal in the United Kingdom, whereby, I don't know if you follow, but a number of members of political society, a number of British citizens who had arrived in the UK as subjects of the British Empire were asked to provide a number of documentation evidence that they had been living throughout, and those who were unable to provide evidence of being naturalized or having lived in the United Kingdom for a certain amount of time, who were unable to show the paperwork, were considered as immigrants that were threatened with deportation. And one of the concessions that the British state made in the wake of an apology to members of this generation, because the discourse was that these were the good immigrants who had come a long time ago and had contributed to British society, versus the bad immigrants who were the ones that citizens had reasons to be worried about. One of the concessions that the government made was to waive the fee that immigrants had to pay in order to become naturalized as British citizens. And so, again, making citizenship conditional on purchase is a return to the days in which wealth and property and money qualifications and education determined who was entitled to be a member of a political society and who had a right to vote. My seventh thesis is that nationalism does the dirty work of capitalism. The linguistic and civic competence tests for accessing citizenship collapse the progressive civic understanding of a political community into its ethno-cultural counterpart. And this, as I said earlier, reduces a universalistic, open and inclusive understanding of what citizenship is about into a particularistic, exclusionary one that is measured and tested against particular ethno-cultural criteria. So if you are an immigrant who has to take a test for becoming a member of British political society or any other state that you're claiming or asking for naturalization, if you fail the test, then you have no right to political membership, to full political membership in the society that you are operating. What that means is you continue to be exploited in the workforce, in the labor market, but you have no political say to defend yourself in the political obtain full representation. And again, this is a return to the days in which people who only spoke dialects, or people who could not read and write in the national language, people who didn't have enough money, people who didn't have property qualifications, were all exploited in the labor market, but didn't have an equivalent say in the political sphere. And so citizenship tests, including the linguistic and civic components that are not problematized, including by cosmopolitan members of political communities, turn a forward-looking, transformative ideal of the political community into a backward-looking, conservative one that brings together the complicity of the nationalist element and the nationalist political forces in these political communities with the exploitation of labor by the capitalist element of the political community. And these linguistic and civic competence tests are premised on the priority of these inherited linguistic and conventional norms that need to be internalized before one can establish one's belonging as a member of good full standing to the political community that they contribute to productively. My eighth thesis is that citizenship in the contemporary capitalist state entrenches structural marginalization. In the past, the struggle for citizenship and the battle for the expansion of the franchise were part of an active fight for progressive inclusion of previously marginalized groups in the political sphere. These were the poor, workers, women, people in the colonies. In contrast, current citizenship policies ratify these exclusions and entrench the divisions of class, race, and gender that are at their root. Citizenship consolidates the divide between those who are seen as deserving to belong to the political community and second-rate members who are not able to show how they satisfy the criteria for becoming members of this political community, be them linguistic criteria or civic criteria. And again, as the recent Whitbread scandal in the United Kingdom showed, instead of being a tool through which to protect vulnerable citizens, vulnerable members of the political community, citizenship, understood in this way, further entrenches their marginalization and segregation at the bottom of society and depoliticizes their understanding of what it means to be a member of this political community. My ninth thesis is that citizenship was only emancipatory when social democracy was the means to fight capitalism. The hope of traditional social democracy in the early 20th century was that democracy would bring in the abolition of class government and that the right to vote would make citizens virtual partners in a cooperative enterprise advancing the good of the political community understood as a whole. And as Edward Bernstein, one of the founding fathers of social democracy, puts it in the preconditions of socialism, I quote, "The parties and the classes that support them learn to recognize the limits of their power and on each occasion to undertake only as much as they can reasonably hope to achieve under the circumstances." Now, it seems to me that the context for this optimistic assessment of what it means to make political compromises and for this inclusionary ideal of citizenship that is potentially open to everyone, that context is no longer there, if it ever was there, as in the optimistic social democratic analysis. When Bernstein talked about compromise between the different classes and coming to political agreements for the sake of the political community as a whole, this was the dawn of an age where barriers to political participation were being removed across the board. So this was the age where obstacles that had to do with property, that had to do with linguistic skills, that had to do with education, were no longer in place. And this is what justified, if it ever justified, the assessment that the political compromise would prevail and that the members of opposing classes would come together to make an agreement for the good of the political community as a whole. And these conditions, if they were ever justified, no longer seem to be in place now. In fact, the trend is precisely the opposite. If in the golden age of expansive citizenship, democracy promised to heal the political community from from the potential destructive effects of class conflict, in the age of restricted citizenship, the struggle seems to be no longer mediated through the institutional channels that contained class struggle in the past. These channels are unable to contain and to institutionalize conflict, as we have also seen this morning. And that's again because once citizenship becomes a good for a restricted few that can be bought and sold and exchanged as a commodity, then the all-inclusive ideal of democracy seems to be an empty promise all over again. My eighth thesis is about the relationship between democracy and capitalism, or rather about the fact that there can be no democracy with capitalism still there. So my 10th thesis is that reviving democratic politics requires overcoming capitalism and not restricting migration. Whilst in theory still paying lip service to an emancipatory ideal of citizenship, progressive democrats around the world are surprisingly silent on the transformation of citizenship and the surrounding trends that I have just been describing, including the exclusionary tendencies that come with these trends. So neither social democratic official policy papers nor left parties' electoral manifestos seem to show any concern with finding measures that could oppose the current trend and find measures that would remedy the current trend. The collapse of civic politics into ethno-politics proceeds undisturbed for the most part with the complicity of the social democratic traditional left. And so does the reduction of the progressive, inclusive, universal ideal of citizenship into the regressive, exclusionary, conservative one. And it seems to me that to counter this trend, it's essential that progressive movements and parties around the world advocate a U-turn on current commitments when it comes to how citizenship is accessed and extended to immigrants. So they ought to campaign, to begin with, for the abolition of practices that reinforce the class basis of the contemporary capitalist state, the contemporary liberal state, including trends like the modalities through which we extend citizenship to migrants. And they have to come up with radically different measures for including migrants in the public sphere. These include, and these are just some examples of policy proposals that someone on the fearless left should come up with. They include the abolition of things like means-tested admission policies, the elimination of selective citizenship, scrapping linguistic and civic competence-based tests, and the elimination of all the practices that commodify citizenship and that reinforce the oligarchic nature of the state. My 11th thesis, and I'm going to disappoint you because it's not the usual 11th thesis, is that the problem is capitalism and not culture. Or rather, it's an 11th thesis adapted to the 21st century. The traditional pragmatic reliance of the left on national democracy to mobilize support for its causes has reached an impasse. Citizenship policies and the current restrictions on the integration of migrants are just one of the prisms through which we can observe the transformation of the democratic state into an oligarchic elite apparatus. Aligned with this regression is the degeneration of that universal ideal of citizenship into a tool for the oppression of minorities. The problem is here not just the existence of territorial boundaries. It's not just about borders who are open or closed, as the cosmopolitans versus communitarians debate would have you believe. The problem is here that exclusions both within the state and between states mutually support each other and serve to further entrench an economic order that we are not challenging at its roots. So timidity on the removal of barriers to civic integration and linguistic integration is not just unjust vis-à-vis those that are excluded from particular political communities, those who are oppressed and marginalized as a result of carrying a different passport. Because these exclusions cut across these divides. They're not just territorial exclusions, they are exclusions within the state as much as exclusions between states. The practice of selling citizenship to the rich and of restricting its access for those with few material means or education or civic skills, I think tells us an important story about the relationship between capitalism and democracy in the 21st century. And insofar we don't challenge that relationship, and so far as we don't criticize the economic order that upholds that relation at the very core, what we end up doing is not just unjust versus migrants, it's unjust versus all of the members of the political community, and it's unjust for everyone. And that was all there. Thank you.
Io propongo di fare come l'abbiamo fatto stamani, cioè diamoci 10 minuti, anche perché è stata abbastanza breve, diamoci 10 minuti, anche un quarto d'ora per domande, obiezioni, commenti, anche perché quello che ha detto lei era molto radicale, no? Cioè in sostanza la cittadinanza è ormai uno strumento di esclusione e il potere, l'accesso ai diritti politici è per ceto, come una volta era per censo, scusate, come una volta era solo per i maschi, ma per censo, e infine, se ho capito bene, la democrazia non è compatibile con il capitalismo, no? Cioè, se vogliamo la democrazia dobbiamo pensare a un'alternativa al capitalismo. Pensare vuol dire fare, no? Come insegnava Marx. Allora, se ci sono domande, obiezioni, contestazioni, c'è qualcuno con il microfono? C'è Wolfgang Network, immagino volato.
Leah, I find most of your 11 theses. I don't buy what you are saying about the relation of capitalism and democracy. Historically spoken, there were only democracies with capitalism. You probably cannot tell me any case historically where you had a democracy without capitalism. So this is an historical argument. The theoretical argument I would like to make is you define simply one type of capitalism. There is a variety of capitalism, and there is a difference between a neoliberal, globalized capitalism and democracy and a socially coordinated capitalism as we have it in the Scandinavian countries. So I would like to oblige you to differentiate to some extent on the one side the different types of capitalism, on the other side the different types of democracy as well.
E facciamo prima di rispondere, per favore, facciamo se ci sono altre domande, altri commenti. C'è qualcuno che vuole dire qualcosa? No? Allora vai.
Great, thank you. So I'm very happy to reply to your historical question by saying that yes, maybe we never had democracy historically. I was qualifying and I made a conditional response when I was saying my paper, if we ever had democracy, this is what it looked like, and it came at the point in which our critique of capitalism was the most advanced. But many radicals will challenge that historically, that thesis as well, and they would say that perhaps democracy was always an ideal and there was never a time in which there were no exclusions in the public sphere, and so perhaps we could say that we never had democracy. So I don't believe that we only had democracy with capitalism. Perhaps we only ever had capitalism and we never had democracy, and democracy is still to come. On the theoretical point, I guess that is part of the empirical argument that I'm trying to introduce. That is to say, how sustainable is it under conditions of advanced globalization to Scandinavian model? Are we really at a different phase, political economic, in which the nation-state, understood as a nation-state with potentially welfarist interpretation of democracy or potentially welfarist interpretation of its institutions, is actually able to contain social conflict in the way in which it was proposed by the traditional social democrats at Bernstein. If the political economic conditions are no longer there, then the varieties of capitalism argument was one that belongs to the past and that cannot be reproposed in the present, because we need to think beyond the limits of the welfare state as traditionally understood by traditional social democrats. We need to think about a welfare state that is potentially open and that is globally extended. that will take us to run against the limitations of capitalism, and so that's where we will kind of hit the fundamental contradiction. So I guess that is for a longer discussion, but the short answer is precisely part of the empirical point. If we take seriously the critics of globalization, critics, including your own criticism this morning about the conditions under which we have a global conflict between labor and capital, if that conflict really is pressing, then we are faced with this fundamental dilemma about what to do with capitalism. Can we have democracy with capitalism? And my answer is no, but I appreciate that this is not to everyone's liking.
Niente, l'ultima chance per contestare le cose molto radicali di se non ci sono altre contestazioni, altre domande, io darei la parola alla professoressa Ann Phillips. Anche Ann Phillips insegna allo School of Economics, se ho capito bene, e si è occupata durante questi anni di questioni di genere, questioni di corpo, di questioni di multiculturalismo, cioè il corpo nel discorso politico, il multiculturalismo, e il titolo della sua relazione è "Non siamo entrambi esseri umani?", punto interrogativo, perché rivolgersi alla nostra comune umanità non è sempre sufficiente. Confesso subito e poi mi taccio che nella discussione odierna qui in Italia sulle questioni di Salvini e sul manifestarsi del nazismo, la bellissima parola d'ordine "siamo tutti umani" a me personalmente mi dà molto fastidio, perché penso che umano è stato anche Hitler, in fondo, no? Cioè siamo tutti umani, compreso Hitler, cioè se siamo tutti umani non vuol dire niente. Allora niente, la parola alla professoressa Phillips.
Thank you very much, and my thanks to the organisers for letting me participate in this event. I mean, we're obviously, the reason that we're gathered together is because of our shared sense that across Europe we face a rise of populist parties amid rising resentment of and hostility towards immigrants, refugees, Muslims, those regarded as the other. Now, I think for those of us trying to find ways to challenge the associated racism, xenophobia and intolerance, one of the very powerful resources that we have is insisting on our common humanity. This was a very important motivating force, for example, during the Second World War, for those who took on the enormous risks of sheltering Jews in Germany and the Nazi-occupied territories, and helping them to escape capture. And in the accounts that those people gave of their actions, their explanations of why they, rather than so many of their neighbours, actually took on the enormous risks of this process, they speak in a very strongly universalist voice. They speak of the people they helped as not so much Jews, but humans. They insist on this shared humanity as far more important than any differences of nationality or religion. So the kinds of phrases that recur in their accounts, and I'm indebted here to a very interesting book by Norman Gerace, the kinds of phrases that recur in their accounts are things like, regardless of who they were, or it did not matter who it was, or no matter what a person's colour, race, religion or language, or Jew or German, it made no difference to me. Eva Agnieszka, who was a Polish socialist who helped save many Jews at this time, I think spoke for many in the way that she explained her actions. And she said, "One saw the Jew not as a Jew, but as a persecuted human being, desperately struggling for life and in need of help, a persecuted, humiliated human being." Or, to give an example from a much less life or death context, I've often found myself invoking these notions of common humanity when trying to contest the retreat across much of Europe from policies of multiculturalism. Now, the two things that have struck me most forcefully about both popular and media criticisms of multiculturalism are first that they tend to hugely exaggerate the extent to which countries in Europe have adopted policies of multiculturalism, and secondly that they hugely exaggerate the extent of our cultural differences. Many of the supposed dangers of multiculturalism turn out, on closer examination, to be based on faulty assumptions about unbridgeable chasms between different cultures. And I think more specifically, they often turn out to be based on faulty assumptions about some people being, well, particularly about people from so-called other cultures, as being more driven by cultural dictates, somehow more swallowed up in the traditions and practices of their culture than is ever assumed to be the case for oneself. So, I mean, in challenging this, I've often quoted anthropologist Laila Abu-Lughal, who, as an anthropologist, of course, is someone who studies cultural difference, but also as an anthropologist is someone who is quite sceptical about some of the claims that are made about cultural difference. And one of the things that she says is that people do not live their lives, quote, as robots programmed with cultural rules, but as people going through life, agonizing over decisions, making mistakes, trying to make themselves look good, enduring tragedies and personal losses, enjoying others, and finding moments of happiness. Much, that is, of what we do in our lives relates to our human rather than our cultural condition. And whatever the so-called culture that we have grown up in, we're not so different the world over in the ways in which we negotiate, adapt, and contest the influences of our family, community, religion, and culture. So, I mean, again, against the essentialisms of cultural difference, it seems to me we can invoke what, as humans, we share. Now, I think as both those examples suggest, the notion of the human, what we have in common as humans, can be a very powerful ethical and political ideal. It's been central, obviously, to the explosion of human rights thinking and politics in recent decades. It's been central to that profound shift from thinking about the rights of man or the rights of the citizen to our rights simply as human beings. In principle, though not yet in practice, this marks a major extension of egalitarianism. It says that all of us, regardless of our gender, race, sexuality, religion, nationality, all of us have the same rights and equality, regardless, simply by virtue of being humans. But there's a problem, and this is the problem that I want to talk about today. The shift to this seemingly egalitarian and inclusive notion of the human, the shift depends on what may be faulty claims about our fundamental similarity. And when it makes the rights depend on the truth of those claims about our fundamental similarity, it makes the equality conditional. So when I suggest, for example, that human beings are much the same the world over, which I confess remains more or less what I think, but when I say things like that, I potentially read everyone else off myself, right? I assume that everyone is just like a kind of version of myself. I read the world as a projection of myself. I flatten out differences. And even more troubling, and this is the thing I particularly want to focus on, I seem to make our claim to be treated as equals depend on the truth of that similarity. I give the fundamental similarity between us as human beings as the reason to treat us as equals, and in doing so, I make the equality conditional. So this is basically what I want to take up today. Despite the seeming inclusiveness of notions of the human and our common humanity, which we evoke very frequently in situations when we're trying to deal with racism or xenophobia or other kinds of intolerance, despite the seeming inclusiveness, the way we currently think about the human too often ends up making our equality as humans conditional. We work too much with the notion that the equality has to be justified and that it can be justified by reference to our shared human nature. So when we try to explain, why should we regard other human beings as our equals? Why should we give refuge to those fleeing from a war zone, for example, or why should we offer citizenship on terms of parity to Christians, atheists, and Muslims? I think we too often slide into ways of justifying this that make, as I say, the equality position. And I think so long as we remain within this paradigm of feeling that we have to give reasons for or justifications for treating other human beings as our equals, we face a slippery slope that leads towards conditions, gradations, and exclusions. So I suggest in what follows 3 ways in which I think we have in the past and continue in the present to make equality conditional. And I end with arguing that we should think of the human as a political rather than a cognitive claim. We should think of our equality not as grounded in something about our shared humanity, but as a commitment we make to others and a claim we make on them. So the first and most obvious conditionality, and this is most apparent when you look at the history of the ways in which people have talked about, made claims about human equality. The most obvious conditionality is when we attach our equality as humans to some substance or characteristic that we are all supposed to share. So it's when we say broadly, it's because as humans we are all X, whatever X is, that we need to be treated as equals. In some contexts this sounds very uncontentious, because the X is usually filled in with something very, very general. But I think in practice it works to exclude. So if you go back to the American Declaration of Independence, 1776, that declaration had the great merit of not offering a reason for treating people as equals. If you remember the phraseology is, we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men, it's men, are created equal. So, by implication, no need to give any evidence or justification. We hold these truths to be self-evident. But of course, reasons were given as to why one should regard people as created equal. And one frequent one at that time was the idea that we had, as humans, the capacity for reason. It was acknowledged, that is, that people varied in their strength, in their wealth, in their intelligence. That all of us, though of course we have to read the all at that time as all white men, and indeed all white men of property, not really all people, that all were said to have the capacity for reason. And it was because of this that they were supposed to be regarded as of equal worth. Now, unfortunately, as we know, unfortunately for the women, and for the many millions who would be subjected to colonial control in the course of the 18th and 19th century, rationality was, and I think still is in many ways, a highly gendered and racialized notion. So focusing on the capacity for reason as the qualifying condition for equality made it seem entirely natural, entirely reasonable to exclude vast majorities, in fact the overwhelming majority of humans. Now, this is a historical illustration, and I don't think we should console ourselves with the idea that this way of trying to pin down what it is that makes it human was just a kind of passing fad. I think, in fact, there's been a resurgence of attempts to pin down what exactly it is that kind of characterizes us as human beings in the light of the worries generated by genetic engineering, artificial intelligence, the worries about the possibilities of creating so-called post or transhumans. And in that context, there's been a kind of increasing resurgence of attempts to define, well, what exactly is this quality that marks out human beings by which we can identify the kind of human essence. So notions of rationality or the capacity to make normative judgments or the capacity to create, there are all kinds of candidates that people offer. But again, these kind of notions about what is this characteristic, this essentially human characteristic, I think comes increasingly up for discussion. I think it's perhaps worth noting, just as an aside, that when people try to pin down what is this characteristic that defines us as human beings, people always look for something rather good about us. You know, it's kind of rationality, the capacity to use tools and create something new. But if you think in terms of what human beings are actually like, it would be just as plausible to claim that the kind of nasty things about us, you know, like willingness to kill, rape, and torture, were the things that were essentially human. It's quite striking that we always pick on the nice things when we try to pin down this thing of what it is that is essentially human. But I think the main point that I'm making is that when we link our claims to be treated as equals to something substantive about the human nature that we supposedly share, we introduce a test. Right? We specify some quality or some characteristic that people are, of course, going to exhibit in different ways and to different degrees. And we then open up the possibility of gradations, of some people seeming more human, more entitled to be treated as equals than others. In other words, we make the equality conditional. I think that's the first way in which we make the equality conditional. There's a second way, and this is when we come to attach our claim to be regarded as equals to a moralized version of what it is to be a human being. So here, it's not just a matter of meeting the qualifying standards of being human. You have to actually go an extra stage and meet the qualifying standards of being a good human. So I think one contemporary illustration, which is particularly pertinent to my own country, is the practice of denying convicted criminals of the right to vote. I mean, if you think about the right to vote had become almost like the one really basic recognition of our equality. We know we live in societies that are characterized by enormous inequalities. But the one thing that we're all supposed to have is the equal right to vote. I mean, you don't any longer get people kind of saying, well, you know, university graduates should have 4 times as many votes as everyone else. Leah has just been telling us about the way in which citizenship increasingly becomes something that you get faster access to if you're rich than if you're poor. But we're still supposed to have this idea that as all citizens have this equal right to vote. But this is not the case if you're a convicted criminal. In the UK, if you're a prisoner, you're not allowed to vote. In the US, of course, in many states of the US, the situation is even worse, that you might not be allowed to vote when you're on probation or when you're on parole. And of course, in some states, convicted prisoners will remain disenfranchised for life. Even after they've served out their full sentence, they've kind of made their compensation for their crimes. And when one takes into account the disproportionate number of African Americans who are sentenced for felonies, this produces a highly racialized pattern of disenfranchisement. I mean, one of the latest figures I've seen, roughly 1 in 13 of African Americans is prohibited from casting a vote in elections. So if you think about what's going on here, there's a way in which these people are being treated as the bad human beings. The human beings who, by virtue of their badness, have been disqualified from what we are otherwise told is a kind of expression of our fundamental human equality. Or you might also think, I think, of the response to Syrian and Iraqi refugees escaping war zones, risking their lives in those treacherous sea crossings to cross to the relative safety of Europe. Now, many people in Europe, including many in Germany and in Italy, responded with great sympathy and support, inspired precisely by those notions of a common humanity. That is, they saw these refugees not as refugees, but as people like themselves, people who had mothers and fathers and brothers and sisters and children, human beings with fears and hopes and dreams. But that support often proved fragile, and one episode that was kind of widely discussed was the reaction in Germany in 2011 2016, after it emerged that many German women celebrating New Year's Eve had been robbed and in some cases sexually attacked by men who were described as of Arab and North African appearance, some of whom turned out to be refugees. Or just think generally of the ways in which populist politicians across Europe and America managed to whip up antagonism to immigrants, refugees, foreigners, through reports of individual ill-doing. Now, what's going on here? I mean, how is this possible? How can these reports of individual ill-doing make any difference? Why should our hearing of some refugees or some immigrants who commit crimes change our perception of or solidarity with immigrants or refugees in general? If it does, what it suggests is that our invocation of our common humanity is premised not just on these people being human beings like us, it's premised on them being good human beings. It's premised on them all being, sterling examples of the very best human qualities. It seems as though it's premised on a kind of idealized humanity that contains no misogynists, no criminals, no men of violence. It's as if the equal concern extended to people because they're human beings turns out to be conditional on them being good human beings. And I think this is this kind of conditionality is especially disturbing because if you think about it, the moment at which we most need to call on those resources of human rights or our common humanity is precisely the point at which people are doing bad things, right? I mean, there's no great, it's no great challenge to see others as your equals or to recognize your common humanity with them when you're dealing with delightful people who share all your interests or who exemplify what you regard as the very best human qualities. There's no difficulty there. It's when people are a more unusual mixture of good and bad, or even are really bad, that the commitment to regarding them all as equal becomes so important. So, I mean, the obvious illustration here is the way in which, in the wake of terrorist attacks, so many people come to think that it's legitimate to torture people who are suspected of terrorism. That is, that they have done something that is so bad that they are now disqualified from the rights that we normally extend to people as human beings. There's a very strongly moralized notion of what it is to be a human being. So, there's a third conditionality that I just want to add. And this links to what Michelle Yorker was commenting on this morning about the problem of abstract individualism. And this is when we tend to make the equality conditional on treating the differences between us as something best ignored. So I think this is somewhat distinct from the first two kinds of conditionality because it's something that comes into play precisely at the moment when people are trying to combat discrimination or prejudice. And I mean, I'm thinking here, precisely of the kinds of comments that those rescuers, those people who worked to help Jews escape Nazi Germany, the kinds of comments that they made as the kind of, we did not see the Jew as a Jew, but as simply as a human being. Or thinking of comments, which I think you hear quite frequently when people are talking about, the importance of not discriminating. They say things like, it doesn't matter, whether you are male or female, or black or white, or lesbian or gay or straight. Or people say things like, Muslim, Jew or Christian, it makes no difference to me. Or a phrase that I used to hear when I was growing up, you don't hear quite so much nowadays, when people would say, we're all the same under the skin. And when you think about those comments, and when you kind of think about what's being said in them, I think it's particularly clear if you take the notion of we're all the same under the skin, because that's a comment which, what it conveys is that there is a problem with the difference of our skin colour. It conveys that, it gives the impression that in some way we need to ignore the other person's skin colour. We need to think of the other as without skin colour, or even we need to think of the other as having skin colour just like our own, in order to be able to see the sense in which we are all the same. So it's actually kind of, in a sense, it's writing into this act of solidarity an expression of, you know, of the kind of the way of an expression of inferiority. Or if you take, if you say Muslim, Christian, or Jew, it makes no difference to me. Which again is a kind of, it's obviously it's a well-intentioned expression of solidarity and a commitment not to discriminate. But to someone who is deeply religious, of course, it makes a huge difference to them what their religious identity is, and saying it makes no difference hardly sounds like an expression of their equal significance or worth. Or just saying, it doesn't matter to me whether you're male or female, white or black, lesbian, gay or straight. You know, well, for those who are on the wrong side of the prejudice, clearly these things do matter. Hannah Arendt, I think, made a related point in a very powerful speech that she gave on humanity in dark times, where she questioned a humanism that claimed commonality across difference while evading the reality of what she described as the world become inhuman. So the occasion for her reflections came with her return to Germany after an interval of more than 25 years to accept the Lessing Prize. So Arendt had left Germany in 1933 after a period in police custody that brought home to her the dangers of remaining there. And she then spent several years in France where she worked for various refugee and welfare organisations. She was interned in 1940 but managed to escape and made her way to the United States where she mainly lived and worked for the rest of her life. So in 1959 she was awarded the Lessing Prize and she returned to Germany. She travelled to Hamburg to receive it, and as I say, this was her first return. And she used the occasion to reflect critically on the notion of the human and our common humanity, and really how little these notions have been able to achieve in those years. So in her acceptance speech, she said she had for many years considered the only adequate reply to the question, who are you, to be a Jew. That answer alone took into account the reality of persecution. Now, as any feminist who's tried to make a friend of Arendt will know, she was no great ally of what we have come to know as identity politics. But her sense, very strong sense, in that kind of context where Jewishness carried such life and death significance, she saw it as, in her words, evasion, simply to insist on a shared humanity. So I'm just going to read a short section from that speech, which I find very, very compelling. In the case of a friendship between a German and a Jew under the conditions of the Third Reich, it would scarcely have been a sign of humanness for the friends to have said, "Are we not both human beings?" It would have been mere evasion of reality and of the world common to both at that time. They would not have been resisting the world as it was. A law that prohibited the intercourse of Jews and Germans could be evaded, but could not be defied by people who denied the reality of the distinction. In keeping with a humanness that had not lost the solid ground of reality, a humanness in the midst of the reality of persecution, they would have had to say to each other, a German and a Jew and friends. So basically in a context where Jewishness carried that kind of life or death reality, significant, she saw it as evasion simply to talk in terms of our shared humanity. I think the idea that we can separate out some kind of core and very abstract self, this humanity that we all share, from all the particularities through which we define ourselves. One of the problems with it is that it represents those particularities, our religion, our gender, our ethnicity, whatever it might be. It represents those particularities as of lesser significance and perhaps even of something to be ashamed of. So this fails to capture what we are as human beings. I mean, we are these differences. And it fails to engage with the recent why we might want to insist on our humanity. I mean, the context in which you find people insisting that they are human beings too is very typically conditions where they have been oppressed or discriminated against precisely because of those particularities. And I think the imaginative setting aside of differences, the kind of, I don't see you as, you know, male or female, black or white, I just see you as a human being. That kind of imaginative setting aside of differences, as long as it remains no more than an act of imagination, it can dissuade us from further analysis of power structures and the power differentials that of course prompted the assertions of the common humanity and becomes that kind of evasion. So, and you know, I mean, we know that there is in the political theory literature, or just generally in philosophical thinking, there's quite a resistance to humanism. And I think quite a lot of it stems precisely from a feeling that calling on our shared humanity too often just papers over the cracks. It obscures the inequalities and the brutalities, and then leaves us somewhat at a loss when those differences nonetheless appear. So just to conclude and to pull this together, I'm arguing that our equality is too often made conditional. It's made conditional either on us exhibiting what's been picked out as the essential human characteristic, or it's made conditional on us meeting some idealized notion of what the human is supposed to be like, or conditional, as in my final example, of setting to one side, imaginatively kind of setting to one side all those things that make us different. And I think against all of these conditionalities, I want to say that equality is not something we need to prove or justify. We don't have to search for reasons or justifications or grounds for thinking that other people are our equals. And I think as soon as we do start searching for those reasons or justifications or grounds, we're already going down the wrong road. We need to think of the human as a claim that we make on others, and as a commitment that we make to others, and not as something that refers to some kind of objectively verifiable characteristic, rationality, self-consciousness, what have you, not as something that we can prove that we share, and not as something that depends on ignoring our actual characteristics. I think we do need a politics of our common humanity, and I think the refugee crisis shows us that. We need a commitment to regard others as our equals, and we need a willingness to forge solidarities across any differences. But it's not helpful to think of this in terms of a reality that grounds our rights, or a set of shared characteristics that we find in some beings but not in others, or a list of characteristics that we can use to work out who gets the rights and who doesn't. Nor, I think, is it helpful to make our status as equals depend on not stressing some of our characteristics, looking beyond or beneath our differences, because I see this as problematic in many ways, as making our equality depend on us having some narrowly defined set. So basically what I'm saying is equality is not a matter of justification, and recognizing others as equals is a political, not a kind of cognitive matter. It's not about kind of like just seeing something in them that you can see that you also share. So we need to detach kind of the notion of the human, that our common humanity, from insidious distinctions that we continue to make between different kinds of humans on the grounds of their cognitive capacities, their moral sensitivity, their willingness to tolerate diversity, and so on. So far as equality is concerned, there should be no gradations. And we don't have to disregard difference in order to arrive at this commitment. We're equal, we're human, not instead of, but as women, men, black, white, gay, lesbian, heterosexual, and so on. And I think in refusing the idea that these are alternative self-descriptions, our politics can push beyond a kind of imagined equality towards strategies for tackling the usually structural causes of our current inequalities. Thank you.
del suo intervento lei lo ha riassunto e quindi è inutile che io aggiunga qualunque cosa. Mi permetto di dire due cose a proposito. Una, a seguire un'altra citazione di Hannah che io trovo bellissima, su questa cosa proprio della soggettività degli esseri, cioè che siamo della soggettività degli esseri umani, che siamo molto soggettivi. C'è una frase in cui lei dice: quando si è attaccati in quanto ebrei ci si difende in quanto ebrei, cioè ci si difende in quanto esseri umani astratti, ma si entra nella cosa, ed è la cosa fondamentale della soggettività. E questo credo, e lo trovo, e anche il fatto che la questione dei migranti e delle discriminazioni o del razzismo è una questione politica, non cognitiva, non umanitaria. Ma è una questione politica, e aggiungo io, poi veramente vorrei che il pubblico parlasse. Io personalmente penso che quando la sinistra assume un linguaggio umanistico-umanitario nelle questioni politiche, in qualche modo resta prigioniero del linguaggio della destra. È una specie di resa al linguaggio della destra, e far vedere alla destra: ma sì, anche gli africani sono umani. È una cosa che non ci possiamo permettere, perché a quel punto abbiamo ceduto praticamente tutto. E niente, se ci sono, spero che ci siano commenti, domande.
Volevo porre un quesito in merito al superamento del concetto di sentirci uguali. Un sociologo italiano sta proponendo un'idea che a me piace moltissimo, che nasce dal fatto che in fondo io sono italiano, ho una figlia brasiliana con la pelle color cioccolato, e questo mi porta assolutamente a non vedere assolutamente il colore della sua pelle. Ho una macchina giapponese, diversi prodotti cinesi, abiti magari fatti in Pakistan, in Myanmar, forse cibo che viene dal Sud America, e questo rende me, al di là di quello che è la caratteristica del sangue, un meticcio. E forse lo siamo tutti. E il considerarmi un meticcio mi fa superare quella che è la diversità nei confronti di altri, perché se culturalmente riesco ad accettare per me stesso questa immagine, posso affiancare anche al concetto di umanità la mancanza di differenza con gli altri, perché siamo tutti uguali rispetto a tutto. Perché in fondo, se andiamo anche a vedere nella storia della nostra famiglia, ci sarà qualcosa che comunque ha creato nella nostra famiglia qualcosa che ha mischiato il sangue, anche così. Però la globalizzazione ci ha portato a questo. Quindi volevo chiedere se questo concetto che sta pian piano emergendo, e ripeto che a me piace moltissimo, può essere sviluppato in una cultura di uguaglianza per tutti. Grazie.
Signor.
Thanks. So I'm very persuaded that a political conception of humanity is greatly preferable to an ontological conception of humanity that's predicated on some truth about who we are. But I guess in light of I'm also very persuaded by Arendt's argument, and to repeat Vlada, the claim that if I'm attacked as a Jew, I should respond as a Jew, and to respond to that attack as a human is depoliticizing. I guess I'm wondering, and why you yourself, after having so forcefully articulated the problem, the depoliticizing nature of appeals to humanity, why you still want to hold on to the category, and why we don't just get rid of the category of humanity and speak in the name of equality instead? Or do you think that the category of humanity is somehow necessary and indispensable for an egalitarian political claim?
Tra poco che intanto rispondi e poi andiamo avanti. Grazie.
Okay, thank you very much for those questions. So to start with the one about to what extent we can kind of we can move on from the divisions and prejudices and discriminations by the recognition of the ways in which all of us in different ways have a kind of mixed history, and none of us is some kind of pure representation of one aspect or another. I mean, there is a lot in that, but I think the point at which I become anxious about it is when we say things like, I don't see the colour of her skin, that is, I see beneath her skin to the real human being underneath. Or if somebody says to me, I don't see you as a woman, I see you as a human being. And I cannot but take that as, in some sense, saying, if I saw you as a woman, I would see you as inferior, right? So I don't see you as a woman, I see you as a human being, or I see you as a professor of political theory, or what have you. There's something about the setting aside of those differences that conveys, unintentionally, almost always, but it conveys a sense that those differences carry a kind of inferiority. So I think that's one of the kind of the problems that one can find in that discourse, even though I think the kind of general principle behind it, which is calling on us all to see the ways in which none of us is a kind of like a pure representative of just one kind of human being. I think that's a good impulse, but I kind of worry about the not seeing the colour of one's skin or not seeing one's gender. And then on the question of why I don't just completely throw away the notion of humanity. To be honest, I don't myself use the notion of humanity or common humanity very much, but I think there's something, I mean, I talk about it as the politics of the human. I think there's some way in which our ideas, our contemporary ideas about equality have used the notion of the human in distinction, say, to the citizen, in order to sort of reach out for a wider conception of equality than the previous one. So instead of talking about the rights of citizens, we talk about the rights of the human. So for me, as long as we can move away from the idea that we have to kind of somehow define that humanness or that humanity in ways that then always create this kind of conditional problem. I don't have a problem with the idea of human rights, for example. I think or at least there are lots of problems with the idea of human rights, which are extensively debated in the literature. But the general principle of human rights, I don't have a problem with. So I don't myself much use the language of humanity, but I don't have any problem with talking still about human rights.
Ci sono altre domande, altri interventi? Prego. Prego.
Mi avventuro sul terreno dove non so se potrò sprofondare i limiti tra l'umano e il disumano, o tra l'umano e il subumano. Dove arrivano? Dove si possono tracciare? Penso a proposte di legge in Spagna per il riconoscimento di, tra virgolette, diritti umani ai primati superiori. E questo sul fronte di una linea da tracciare appunto tra umano, specie umana e specie finora considerate non umane. Penso, a proposito dell'incondizionalità del riconoscimento, della non subordinazione del riconoscimento di umanità, alla possibilità di dover riconoscere la qualifica di umano ai nazisti, allo stesso Hitler, come procediamo su questo terreno che non solo è scivoloso, ma forse rischia di rompersi sotto i nostri piedi. Grazie.
Se non ci sono altri commenti, altre domande, prego.
Thank you very much. So my answer to that question, which is a very good question, is I would make a complete distinction between the question about whether Nazis or Hitler can be regarded as human. Absolutely yes, right. Within the category of humans, there is nobody who is subhuman. There is nobody who doesn't qualify for being described as a human. But one of the problems with my kind of argument, which a number of people have pointed out to me, is that it does seem to create this rather strong divide then between humans and animals, right? And I mean, in a sense, some of the ways in which people have talked about animal rights is to say, well, there are certain characteristics that humans have, and some of those characteristics are shared by animals, you know, so we pride ourselves on being tool makers, and then we discover that actually there are lots of kind of animal species that also use tools, or whatever the example would be. So some of the arguments that people give for extending rights to animals depend on something that I'm refusing, that is, they depend on starting with a kind of an idea of what is the human characteristic, and then saying, ah yes, and I see some of that in some animals, so let's extend rights to them. And in my argument, in a sense, I'm not open to that, because it's crucial to my argument that we don't allow for gradations, right? So I don't see a continuum between human qualities, which some humans have more than others, some humans have less with others, some animals have a bit of, other animals have none of. I think thinking like that creates problems for the way we think about human. So the way we need to think about our obligations to non-human animals, which I think we have to think about and are very important, but I don't think it can be that kind of argument. But I'm aware that it's something that makes my it creates a certain vulnerability in my argument, because I'm challenging exclusions, but I'm ending up with one very big exclusion when it comes to that divide between human and animal. But the divide of the kind of the language of subhuman, inhuman, as applied to human beings, I think we should just reject. We're all human.
Sì, credo c'è sempre un'altra novizica che vuole intervenire e poi...
I'm not sure if I will be able to elaborate very well in English what I would like to say, and I hope you will understand. I think that why perspective of looking at humans from animals perspective is not about saying in which what animals are similar or not to humans. It's more to show how humans, in comparison with animals, are similar to each other. If you take animals, if you take only one species of any animal, like dogs, there is such a variety of dogs, from small to big, and so on. And then if you take all animal world as a reference point, diversity is huge. So when you, from this perspective, you look at humans, what are these differences among humans? What do they matter? The color, or I don't know, whatever. They are so not important, not essential when you look at the rest of the world of living creatures. I don't know if I was understandable what I was saying. Thank you.
Yes, I think that's helpful, but I think I would would stress again that when we think about the differences between humans, I think so much of the time we're involved in a necessary balancing act between, on the one hand, the important impulse to say these differences don't matter, and the equally important impulse to say these differences do matter because we live in societies which make these differences matter. And if we pretend that they don't matter, then we are simply we're simply accepting the status quo, we're giving up the attempt to challenge that. So, there are many contexts in which you do want to say there's enormous diversity and these differences don't matter. But if we simply say that, then I think we give up the political struggle. So there's I think, a continuing balancing act that we're engaged in thinking about the point, the context in which we want to say the differences don't matter, the context in which it would be a real invasion of reality to say that the differences don't matter.
Direi che l'ultimissima domanda o annotazione, perché ho visto una persona che voleva dire qualcosa e poi passeremo.
Thank you. My observation is let's think more about connections than about differences, understanding, explaining. There are so many connections beyond human connections. I think we speak about globalization, we speak about interconnected world, sustainability, and I think we have a long period behind us, or sustainability inside it, about separating artificially what is naturally united. So, what do you think about that?
So, there's been a long discussion at various stages within feminist politics about how one thinks about solidarities, alliances, coalitions, and increasingly I think the consensus in thinking about that is that of course we need to make connections all the time, but making connections in the sense without pretending away the points of difference is a crucial part of making those connections. So if I've understood what you're getting at, it seems to me that I completely agree about the importance of connections, but they have to be connections which aren't premised on a kind of imaginatively wishing away what are points of difference, conflict, and indeed disagreement.
Ok, grazie tante alla professoressa Phillips. Io prima di passare la parola a Bashir, una sola frase a proposito dell'umanità, disumanità di Hitler, una storia che raramente viene raccontata e che riguarda il processo di Eichmann a Gerusalemme. A Gerusalemme a quel tempo ci fu una petizione degli intellettuali israeliani, vi ricordo solo due nomi, in questo momento Martin Buber e Golda, era una delle più grandi poetesse del XX secolo in assoluto, che chiesero di non eseguire la pena di morte contro Eichmann, cioè perché quando si è contro la pena di morte si è contro la pena di morte ad Eichmann o a Hitler, non contro la pena di morte a un ladro. Mi sembra evidente che i principi vanno applicati nelle situazioni più estreme e per questo esistono, penso io almeno. Allora, Bashir a proposito di Gerusalemme insegna all'Università ebraica di Gerusalemme, è professore all'Istituto Forlì, è palestinese e parlerà di un tema che il titolo era in inglese, io l'ho tradotto malamente, ma più o meno è cittadinanza islamofobica e la predicazione del liberalismo, perché finora abbiamo parlato dell'integrazione degli immigrati, che cosa facciamo con i migranti e finalmente c'è anche quell'altra questione, cioè il nostro pregiudizio nei confronti dei migranti, soprattutto quando vengono dalla cultura islamica. Prego.
Thank you very much. Thanks for the invitation and thank you for bearing with us in this late time of the evening. For many, we we do live in a time of political disorientation. For many, we live in time of intellectual fatigue. Or for many, we live in time of serious anxiety. These characterizations are often labeled by people who are on the left and the liberal camp. For many, the reasons of the rise of the new left in the West, the decline of welfare policies in some countries, the issues of refugees, the issues of globalization, and many other issues of conditions of poverty in different parts of the world. They all pose to us very serious issues and very serious challenges. Now, these are issues that are often entertained and articulated within the circles of many scholars, but mostly liberals and on the left. And as a consequence, for many, we are really living in a time of crisis at which we need to rethink, basically, in light of these challenges and the rise of right-wing politics and the new right, we need to rethink liberal democracy and liberalism so it deals adequately with these challenges. So what I want to do today with you is basically speak about these certain attempts, not all of them, but certain very few particular attempts of certain cultures on the right, on the left and right, sorry, on the left and liberals, that attempt to reinvigorate liberal democracy so it deals adequately with the challenges that seemingly the new right seems to be doing better job, and therefore more and more people are voting to them, etc., etc. Now, for me to do that, I want to make the following observation or argument. I want to make the claim that those liberals or liberal democrats who try to reintroduce or rethink liberal democracy are making a shift that is moving from what we could say minoritarian liberal politics into majoritarian liberal politics. And I want to make the claim that this shift, i.e. from a politics that promotes minority rights, immigrants, etc., which can be labeled in a very reductionist fashion as multicultural politics, but not only, to majoritarian politics where liberalism or liberal democracy is introduced as an ideology or a form of politics that really deals also with the bulk of the citizenry rather than just minority, that is called majoritarian politics. I'm making it very simple. I want to make the argument at the end of this that this shift is really the way the ones that I am going to talk about, they do it in a very wanting way, i.e. that their attempt to reinvigorate liberalism, the way they present it, remains to be wanting, meaning that remains to be problematic. And why is that? Because in the overwhelming majority of the cases that I examine here, the ones that are identified as the reason also among other considerations to reinvigorate liberalism when it comes to questions of diversity are the Muslims or the question of Muslim or the question of Islam in Europe, okay? So the question of Islam or Muslims in Europe actually seem to be some of the most challenging issues that face those who try to reinvigorate liberalism according to certain circles. And I think this is somehow, if you wish, the elephant in the room that hasn't been addressed adequately in today's intervention, at least in a very explicit way, I would make the argument. Especially that many of these attempts that try to reinvigorate liberalism actually relate not only to the decline of the welfare state, but also to the question of immigration, when immigration is usually reduced to Muslims and Islam, and usually Muslims and Islam are presented through the lens of hierarchical order of constituting a threat, constituting incompatibility, and constituting an entity that is unadmissible, and assimilationist, that you cannot assimilate it in a way. So that's basically what I would try to do, and I want to link that issue to the issue of the secular or secularism in Europe, the way it is produced within also country, within all the circles of liberty. So, obviously, those who are in this hall, probably many of you would understand also that actually liberalism was under serious pressures in the 50s and the 60s of the previous century, when we had the civil rights movements in the US and many other quarters, when something called the New Left emerged, which is a replica for many movements and coalition of different groups who are making different political claims But nevertheless, what unified them, that was the critique of the ideology of liberal rights. And the claim was that liberal rights was not enough in its ideology or in its political system to accommodate claims of many excluded groups. And these came from different directions and different ways. Now, to cut a parallel story short, because that's not my focus, that what has happened with the time is that liberalism or liberal democracy were rather accommodated and swallowed many of these critiques, and they accommodated these critiques through introducing revised version of liberal politics, whether that is multiculturalism in its different variants, whether that's liberal, radical, or communitarian, or other notions of rethinking liberalism or liberal democracy was obviously deliberative democracy of Habermas and many others variants, which also insisted on having inclusive voices, making more space for other voices to be coming. Now, most of these types of politics was developing not exclusively but mainly in relations to demands who came from minorities, okay? Whether these were like, ethnic minorities, national minorities, different groups that were seen as being excluded as and oppressed in the political system. Now, this new stage of those who are trying to rethink or reinvigorate liberalism or liberal democracy are not interested mostly with questions of minority, actually. They are saying now that there are challenges that are really facing this question of look at what is politics happening in European countries, and we have forgotten the bulk of citizenry. We have, instead of focusing on what they call identity politics, okay? That the multicultural introduced this identity politics has really shifted politics to cultural issues and to identity politics, where the politics has become about outrage, about minority rights, about identity, essentialism, etc., which all led to fragmentation, supposedly the argument goes, and the decline of welfare state. And Phillips was suggesting earlier that there is no serious convincing link between these parties. I mean, that the retreat of multiculturalism is not necessarily has to do with the fact that immigrants and minority rights really put in threat welfare policies. But that's at least at the level of what the argument was. Now, these new attempts on certain quarters of liberal thinking, and I'm not saying all liberals are like this, or all liberals who attempt to introduce new ideas are going through these lines, but there are many attempts that actually try to go through these lines through which we can identify them as going to this majoritarian level of politics, meaning focusing on the bulk of the society. And they do it in a very particular way. And I want to name 3 attempts, but quickly in a very simplistic fashion. The first attempt is what has been published a few weeks ago in The Economist. In The Economist, there was this manifesto for renewing liberalism. And this manifesto for renewing liberalism was really fascinating piece to read. Not that there is serious, substantive, illuminating ideas as much as there are alarming ideas. And the main argument, just the arguments that are relevant to my talk here is that basically they were saying that liberal democracy and liberalism bought too much into multiculturalism and specific identity politics. Identity politics brought us to a serious crisis. This crisis leads to fragmentation, balkanization, decline of welfare policies, and to serious issues of securities and threats introduced by immigrants, and mostly, for that matter, Muslims immigrants, as pointed out. And therefore, their claim in this manifesto for renewing liberalism of The Economist, and The Economist is a journal that is published in London, in Britain, and globally, kind of widespread and read by many people, was saying that what needs to be restored is actually coming back to the true spirit of liberalism, and that is radicalism, reform, and change. And coming back to radicalism, reform, and change basically calls for what they call, that liberals really forgot the spirit of reform, civic respect for all, and freedom and common interest. So again, if we were to catch this, if you were to get a closer reader of this manifesto, you closely get into basically this majoritarian form of politics that try to distance itself away from addressing issues of diversity and heterogeneity by trying to jump above these kind of things by saying what we need civic spirit and what brings us together rather than what divides us, etc., etc. The second one, which also a few weeks ago was published, which Michelle earlier was mentioning, as well as Wolfgang was mentioning earlier, Fukuyama. Not that I am a huge fan and a big fan of Fukuyama for whatever reason, but nevertheless, Fukuyama published an article a few weeks ago in the Foreign Affairs. And according to this article in the Foreign Affairs, and in which Fukuyama basically says that basically liberalism's main problem in today's condition is its adoption of multicultural politics, liberal multiculturalism, and identity politics in particular. And why? Again, labeling similar kind of arguments against multiculturalism and identity politics, focusing on the disadvantage, focusing in the worst of in society, to borrow from roles and ideas, and focusing on these kind of marginalized groups, etc., etc. And therefore, this collapsed, according to Fukuyama, at least in that article. He cited almost all of those political theories that I know without even recognizing and acknowledging any of them, but that's not the point. The point that he was trying to make that, that we are moving to identity politics and labels the rest of identity politics, and they say, right-wing politics or the new right poses very serious threat to the liberal democracy. We need to face that, and the solution is definitely not going to the socialist, Marxist, neo-Marxist ideas of trying to take us to the other side, and he diagnoses this in a very, in my point of view, in a very simplistic way. But the most important things for our context here is that what does Fukuyama propose? And Fukuyama proposes that he says basically what we need to do is that we need really to shift the politics to a majoritarian form of politics, where the emphasis is in socio-economic ideas, and rather than outrage and identity politics of claims of culture and identities. And we need really to do this through inventing or through promoting what he called creedal national identity. And this creedal national identity is basically the goal that we have, we all share, if you wish, identity that is built around values like constitutionalism, the rule of law, human equality, but surely not ethnicity, race, or religion. So the cement, the glue that brings us together as citizenry is not race, is not ethnicity, is not culture, is not identity, but our commitment to constitutionalism, the rule of law, human equality, and obviously what he says, civic values. Now, if you wish, this is another kind of reworking some of Habermas' constitution and patriotism, but I wouldn't go too much into that. At least here in the level of nation-state, there is more in Habermas than the nation-state. But then he comes and says, as a requirement of this adoption of this creedal national identity, what we need to do is introduce new citizenship laws, according to which basically what we need to do is posing very strict requirements as Dea was indicating about linguistic competence, about familiarity with civic commitments, about familiarity with the rule and the history of the country, and different requirements, and then saying that what needs to be established is basically a citizenship law according to civic commitments rather than according to blood, etc., etc. And therefore, Fukuyama goes explicitly against any serious multicultural programs in the US by saying that we need actually to actively work to cancel any bilingual or trilingual programs of education in schools, and actually actively work in assimilating actually immigrants and actually in the way to create this civic common national identity, and in both, whether that is the Economist Manifesto or Fukuyama, both of them say, and it's about time that liberalism and liberal democracy, interchangeably, although there are serious differences between these names, but for the sake of simplicity, I'm just mentioning them here. That what we need to do is actually claim nationalism rather than being, afraid of it or mocking it or going away. We need to claim nationalism. i.e., historically liberals supposedly had serious issues, as if they had serious issues with nationalism, meaning that nationalism is collectivist and there is a contradiction between the individual rights and the collective rights, and therefore, nationalism is problematic. So these liberals that I'm mentioning here, whether Mengistu or Fukuyama, calls for actually taking over nationalism, claiming nationalism to be liberal by inserting a different content to it, okay? So nationalism, in their understanding here, will have to have a civic content of some sort. It shouldn't be organized around religion or identity or ethnicity, but it should be around, organized around civic values and these types of commitments. Now, again, this is really very interesting that a third scholar that comes into, and the last one that I want to mention here is also a political theorist called Liav Organ, an Israeli political theorist that is based in Europe at the moment. And Liav Organ comes with this theory that he says, actually, it's not that the minorities that need protections, actually. It's more the majorities that are in need of protections. And he develops what he calls, a liberal theory of distinct majority rights. And basically what he's proposing there, he says, in light of immigration, globalization, demographic changes, what needs to be done is to institutionalize immigration and citizenship rights, to which we need to protect the majority rather than the minority. And through that example, he basically says that this is how we protect the culture of majority groups. And obviously, those who get into the deeper analysis of what Liav tries to do is actually an apologetic account to Israel. Basically, taking the Israeli example to be an ideal type through which, he generalizes and theorizes in a very apologetic manner to actually the state of Israel and the claim of Zionism for vulgar chauvinistic form of nationalism that prioritizes Jews and reproduces Jewish supremacy vis-a-vis the Palestinian Arabs in Israel. So, now, but without going too much into each one of these, but what is really, with some differences obviously, what is really common to them are three issues. A, they call for the shift from a minoritarian politics to a majoritarian politics. Second, they identify all identity politics, the politics of recognition and all that comes with that, with multiculturalism and different policies, as a serious threat to liberal democracy or as a serious cause to serious ills that are now faced by liberal democracies. And the third one is that they claim to introduce a new we, the nation, the people, according to which organizes us all together, not ethnicity, religion, and identity, but actually what he calls, or what they call in different articulation, civic, and they try to do it in a very sophisticated way, although Liav here has some very particular escape how he does that, but I'm not going to bore you with that, okay? So what are my concerns here, okay? Because in the coming 10 minutes, I have 10 minutes, yeah? So in the coming 10 minutes, I want really to label, so what are my serious concerns with this? As much as I think there is a very serious space to rethink and reinvigorate liberalism, as if liberalism was never being rethought. It's always being rethought. It's one of the most elastic ideologies and political doctrines that we know anyway. My concern with those who try, to rethink or reinvigorate liberalism along the lines that are proposed by these three instances. And by the way, I'm not saying these three instances exhaustive or representative of the wide range of liberal thinking, obviously, but I'm saying that there is a very serious trend within the liberals who are trying to see, get out of the crisis that are going along these lines. The issue that I am seriously concerned about are really two issues, and they are interlinked. The first is that the way they treat diversity. Their answer to diversity seems to be resorting and falling back to adopting conventional liberal strategies that are adopted in the past by different liberal modalities and different liberal trials, attempts. Most importantly, if I were to summarize this point, they really resort to what we call assimilationist type of politics. So I am not entirely convinced to which extent what they propose, I'm not entirely sure to which extent that what they propose is really providing a sufficient convincing answer to the question of diversity and heterogeneity in the overwhelming societies that we know in Europe or elsewhere in the world. So what is it new in here that really avoids the oppression, the exclusion, and the very aggressive assimilationist type of politics in its very radical form of melting pot and in its milder forms of semi-integrationist politics? They don't seem to be really providing here a very convincing answer, and actually I remain to be very puzzled with their proposal. But when we link this to the second point, I think things become clearer why they seem to be escaping this, in my point of view. And I'm not attaching here conspiracy of any sort, but I just really ground this in their claims and in different writings that they do. And that is actually when they reduce and identify the issue of immigration to be as one of the biggest challenges that faces liberal democracy, tying this to immigration and demographic changes. Now, when they do that, usually they follow one further step, and that one further step is identifying Muslim and Islam in particular, as the type of culturally incompatible or groups that are assimilable, that you can't assimilate them in the politics. And one of the way they try also to do that, through the introduction of the notion of the secular. Let me just drink water. And in that sense, I want to make the argument here that not only referring to Islam and Muslims as sociologically, but I want, as I will show shortly, I want to link what we call the Islamic or the Muslim question in Europe as is now developing in different quarters in Europe. I want to link it at the very end of my talk also to the Judophobia and to the anti-Semitic question, or to what we call the Jewish question. And I think I will make the argument at the very end that these are inseparable. These are inseparable, although they are emerging in different contexts and in different circumstances, but they are inseparable. And how do they do this type of thing? Like, how do they try to address this question of Muslims and Islam, Muslim and immigrants and Islam as a very serious challenge, through the entry or the introduction again of a very typical liberal technique, and that is the secular or secularism. Okay? And the secular says basically that we, in a very simplistic fashion, we divide between the private and the public, and what we do basically is that we invite different diversities to be articulated and expressed in the private sphere, and in the public sphere it is the domain of sameness or the domains of formalism and neutrality and equality in legal terms. Now, what is really very interesting in this sense, that it's very often when they invoke these issues of secularism or what we call legal neutrality through the techniques that they deploy, actually, the resort to this secular is very problematic from the perspective, at least, that this is a post-Christian idea, i.e. that actually the secular is actually a very much a Christian, has a Christian bias tendency in it, and actually its beginnings and roots is very much related to the Christian history, and it's actually a very much Protestant, tracing it to Protestant ideas, at least in some understanding. And there were many theorists, at least, that they were making the claim that the issue of the secular has this European roots all the way from Connolly William. I don't know if you know this political theorist from the US, which basically was making the claim that this claim of neutrality and the division between the private and the public as a mechanism of inclusion ends actually up in a way that actually produces and reproduces exclusion. And obviously a very prominent work of Talal Asad from NYU, very interesting in this context, thinking that actually the secular is actually a serious Christian idea that created and constructed what we know religion. meaning basically very much attributes a lot of developments that need to do with Europe and Christianity itself. And not only that, that actually within that kind of religion perspective, that usually was made in relation to Judaism, but not only to Judaism. And other scholars have said, such as Jilin Najjar from Colombia, that actually this secular history actually constructed the Jews as the internal theological other and enemy, and constructed the Muslim as the external and political enemy. And one of the most interesting categories of this, that when they make the claim of resorting to what they call Judeo-Christian civilization, many of these scholars, including these, definitely in the case of Riyad and definitely in the case of Fukuyama, saying that we need to bring back to the origins of the Judeo-Christian kind of civilization as the roots and the origin of enlightened, progressive, liberal kind of ideas among other ideas. Actually, and this is really a very problematic post-Holocaust constructions, discursive constructions of particular sort. Because, before the Holocaust, the Jews were not Jew-Christians that much. Actually, they were the ultimate internal other in Europe, which were taken to murderous industry of death and disgusting, by the Nazi beast, taken to destinies of death, rather than that they were viewed as, as an accommodated internal other that needs to be respected. But simultaneously, tied to the ideas of Orientalism, i.e. Orientalism actually is as old probably as, not as old, but is enough old to be linked also to ideas of anti-Semitism. In that sense, this is basically the contribution of Talal Asad expanding Edward Said, and Jilin Najjar takes Talal Asad to indicate this enmity that Christian Europe has created, or the Christian West has created between Arabs and Jews by externalizing and internalizing them. Now, I don't want to go too much into details. I'm very happy to elaborate on this in the types of questions, if you have any about that. But what I'm trying to make the claim is actually rather simple, and that is to challenge and undermine the entry of secularism, or the secular in particular, not secularism and ideology, but the secular in terms of practice, as to be the way of how we can deal with diversity. I see the answer to religious diversity in that sense in the case of Muslims, because the Jews now don't really pose any serious threat to Europe anymore, because they are insignificant in terms of number and demography, and they have become recasted to be white. They are not Semites anymore, okay? Now, of course, the right wing now is introducing them again as, again, re-Semitizing them, but that remains to be the exception in a way or another, And obviously Zionism plays very much hand in that, okay? Zionism actually plays very much into saying that they are now the oasis of Europe in the Middle East, in the midst of the savages, and this is now, in that sense, actually, Zionism is very complicit with these kind of, Islamophobic tendencies that are, and this is by no coincidence, by the way, that Benjamin Netanyahu is very good friend with the government of Hungary, with the government of Poland, with the government of many of these actually ultra-nationalist, chauvinistic forms of nationalism that emerging. And from that sense, I think that's something that tainted Zionism for a very long history, including its labor, but I'm not going into that at the moment. So what I'm trying to make is this idea is that the secular does not really solve the issue when it comes to these types of diversity. So what is there that we can think of positively? And I might be disappointing you in the remaining 2 minutes that I have, that I don't have actually a very explicit, productive way, because this is work in progress and I'm reflecting on this. But one thing that we need really to do, definitely in any encounters of trying to reinvigorate any inclusive notion of citizenship that is not Islamophobic, and again, not Islamophobic meaning not reduced only to Islam, but in its hostility to, or its failure to deal adequately with one particular or with some particular types of differences. And that is that I think introducing decolonization here would really do some interesting work. And what I mean by decolonization here is that Europe needs to come to serious terms with its colonial history and suppressed memory of colonialism. Definitely when it comes to the issues of refugees, immigrants, because the overwhelming majorities of these immigrants actually come from ex-colonies of European countries. And really what is really very interesting in relation to these issues of Islamophobia and Islam is actually many European countries, but not only, have a preferred Christian Arabs or Christians coming from the Middle East over Muslims under the pretext of cultural compatibility. So they would refer Syrian Christian refugees over Muslim Syrian refugees. And by the way, there are indications of very explicit data that suggest that actually many European countries and Western countries such as the US, Australia, I know this is in the case of Lebanon and Palestine, for instance, that have facilitated for now decades local Arabs to get access to visas and immigrations of our Muslims under this pretext. So in that, what I am trying to say here, and by this I conclude, is that actually the issue of decolonization remains to be a very interesting path through which we really try to deconstruct these relations of domination and historical, continuity of this content. Because thinking to detach and disconnect Europe from that history that has continuous implications in today's politics, I think that would be a very problematic thing to do. And thinking that you can conduct liberalism in isolation from imperial, colonial kind of capitalist form of politics that you deploy in different parts of the world, I think that would be something that is very unfortunate if we think that this is a venue that we can engage on without seriously unpacking this. And the last point is that, in this context is, diversity is here to remain. This is like, a constitutive character of human condition. So trying to jump over these questions of diversity without seriously tackling them by labeling liberal multiculturalism or other revised versions of democracy such as deliberative democracy as to be the one in charge of, or the one who are responsible for all the types of ills of liberal democracy at the moment, and therefore we need to detach ourselves, or we need to distance ourselves from them and resort to certain classical liberal principle. I don't think this is really brings us closer, but it remains to be a very apologetic form of politics to the right-wing form of politics. Thank you.
Grazie al professor Bashir che sai, un po' come all'interno del discorso liberale si può costruire un nemico interno, non se ho capito bene. E ci sono domande, ci sono commenti, ci sono obiezioni e ci sono reazioni. Prego, ci sono due.
Vorrei fare un'osservazione riguardo al fatto che non c'è un grande pericolo di antisemitismo, che ho sentito dire anche ieri, per la verità, per questo volevo portare la mia testimonianza di insegnante e dire che oggi a Roma i bambini di 13 anni affrontano per la prima volta la storia del Novecento, sono passati i programmi scolastici, quindi la storia del Novecento arrivano a studiarla a 13 anni e quando arrivano a studiarla questi bambini di Roma spesso pensano che ebreo sia un insulto. Perché lo pensano? Lo rende idiota o cretino, perché lo sentono nello stadio. Loro sono tifosi della Roma, della Lazio, vanno allo stadio, guardano le partite e sono convinti che questo sia un insulto. E non sono ragazzini che vengono da famiglie di estrema destra, cioè una realtà abbastanza diffusa. Quindi secondo me è sottovalutato quello che è stato detto ieri e quello che sento dire anche adesso Bashir, che non è un gran pericolo perché ormai sono bianchi, sono assentati. Io non credo che questo sia vero. Poi un'altra cosa, un'altra osservazione è che secondo me è un pochino riduttivo dire che la paura dell'immigrazione è la paura dell'Islam, sebbene io capisca che c'è una forte base di verità perché lotta al terrorismo eccetera, però sempre a Roma dove io vivo ci sono tantissime comunità di tantissimi tipi, alcune vivono in stato di segregazione, sono più invisi penso ancora degli islamici, per esempio i cinesi, che non hanno niente a che fare con l'Islam. Quindi insomma il discorso è più vasto. Grazie.
Bashir risponde alla fine, 2 o 3 domande per rispondere.
I agree with you in terms of the way in which many countries in Europe, including the UK, we're seeing a backlash against the concept of multiculturalism. It pains me to think about the backlash in countries where multiculturalism never even embedded itself. So I think that multiculturalism as a model, for example, in the UK context, was certainly a very progressive one compared to the previous assimilationist model. And we now in the UK have moved back into that assimilationist mode, except that it's masquerading as integration policy. So I totally agree with you that I think at the moment what we're seeing is majoritarianism masquerading, majoritarianism that is kind of masquerading as assimilation. Which leads me to the question of what do we do with multiculturalism as a concept? Given that there were also very valid critiques of multiculturalism in the way in which it was practiced, not as a fact, but as an official policy. And that was also rooted in colonial policies. It was a product of colonialism in the sense that it kind of tended to attribute religion to minorities, homogenize them, failed to look at internal divisions of class, caste, gender, and so on, and allowed leaderships to form which were often not representative of minorities, particularly not women. So there were valid critiques to be made of multiculturalism. The problem, I think, with multiculturalism is always an unfinished project, because it kind of valued diversity, which was really important in the struggle against anti-racism. But it stopped at that point. Diversity, recognizing diversity, became an end in itself, rather than the objective, the goal of equality. Diversity on its own is not enough. It's whether you understand diversity and move towards equality as a result of diversity. That's the end game. So the question is this, that when you're faced with a multicultural model that's also problematic, that also nourish identity politics, and certainly I've seen in the UK, for example, the ways in which religious identity politics has grown and grown. And it's a regressive religious identity politics that's grown. And it comes from other forces of imperialism, which is to do with the way in which Islam has been Arabized, the way in which the Saudis have exported a particular notion of Islam, the way in which that notion of Islam, a rigid, austere, fundamentalist notion, is replacing more traditional, secular notions of Islam too, then we have a problem, because what we're saying is actually that minorities, the secularism is a concept that we should not vacate to the West alone, because that's precisely what the multicultural model did. It attributed religion to minorities as opposed to secular traditions within minorities. Those were suppressed. So I ask the question, which is I totally agree with your critique, and the fact that there is a majoritarianism that's masquerading as nationalism, as assimilation, there is a racism, there is a xenophobia, there is even the othering of Muslims, but at the same time there are countering political forces, particularly the rise of religious fundamentalism, and how we deal with the fact that they too would like to see us vacate the secular space.
Ci sono altri interventi? Vorrei, se non ci sono altri interventi, altre domande, altri interventi, vorrei io sostituirmi a qualcuno del pubblico, cioè faccio finta di essere io uno del pubblico. E vorrei porti un problema, più che una domanda, un problema. Allora, io sono molto d'accordo sulla cosa Bashir che hai detto sul fatto che l'islamofobia, il linguaggio dell'elitista, l'omofobia si sostituisce al linguaggio antisemita, no? Cioè, l'ho anche scritto più volte, cioè basta sostituire la parola musulmano con la parola ebrea, abbiamo la stessa identica frase. Anche perché forse l'antisemitismo è la matrice dei razzismi nella modernità. E tuttavia tu hai fatto mi riallaccio anche a quello che è stato appena detto. Tu hai fatto forse esempi di società anglosassone, no? Se riportiamo quello di cui stavamo parlando, l'assimilazionismo e la spinta o costringere la minoranza ad assimilarsi, forse per esempio in una società come italiana i termini della discussione non sono identici, perché una cosa che stiamo dibattendo qui, te la sto ponendo sinceramente non tanto per contestarti. Allora, una società come quella italiana che non ha una grande storia coloniale, nel senso che ha una storia coloniale miserrima e senza scambi veri, tranne che gli italiani hanno ammazzato degli etiopi e eritrei, hanno fatto dei disastri nei Balcani, ma quella non era coloniale, ma non c'è stato quello scambio che c'è stato per esempio tra la Gran Bretagna e le colonie o la Francia e le colonie, per quanto fosse stato uno scambio assolutamente diseguale e imperialista, però c'è stato, ma qui questo non c'è stato. Quindi è una società la cui cultura è strettamente, intimamente legata ai simboli di cristianità. Okay? Allora, tu non puoi leggere Dante, non puoi capire Dante se non sai chi era la donna e se non hai i minimi termini, se non conosci i minimi termini della fede cristiana, della cultura cristiana, non della cultura, lo dico da non cristiano, non puoi. Come non puoi apprezzare fino in fondo Michelangelo, cioè sì, lo puoi apprezzare esteticamente, ma in qualche modo per diventare italiano devi avere quelle nozioni. Non sto dando un valore a questo fatto, sto dando un dato che mi sembra più sociologico che altro, che non significa che tu ti devi assimilare, però che in qualche modo puoi arricchire la cultura italiana con le tue cose, con la tua identità laica, come ha fatto per esempio Bassani, un grande scrittore ferrarese, o come ha fatto Primo Levi con tanti altri, no? Ma è difficile che tu prescinda, che tu diventi italiano a prescindere da questa cosa e a prescindere che tu possa diventare italiano senza in qualche modo assumerti queste cose. Non so se mi spiego.
Okay, thank you. These are very useful questions. So, of course, I was not trying to underestimate the significance of, and the danger of anti-Semitism. Not in Italy, not elsewhere in the world, and surely not in Europe. That's definitely was not my claim. I'm just saying that as much as this is on the rise, and anti-Semitism is on the rise for sure in Europe and other places, but I was just thinking that that the question of these three examples that I was naming, the question of diversity around which they articulate their proposals seem to be much more concerned with Islam and with Muslims than with other things. That again, now I do believe and I do think, observation-wise, that Muslims and Islam at least has much more prominence in terms of being constituting a threat in Europe than certain communities of Jews, in Europe. That is not again to underestimate anti-Semitism or to give any exemption to either history or to contemporary conditions. And the other way around, actually, I think in the very basic structure, conceptually and historically, that allowed anti-Semitism operates in different circumstances also I'm not saying that this is a copy and paste, but that actually the foundations of anti-Semitism seem to be working in a similar way vis-a-vis actually constituting Muslims today with different ethnic specificities and particulars of the current conditions in relation to, a racialized other. So there is no underestimation of whatsoever of anti-Semitism in Europe at all. I just say that I think the much more pressing, according to the terms of these scholars and these manifestos, were basically identifying Islam and Muslims as to be the main challenge that seems to be pose issues into immigration. And this takes me to the second point that you made, that I'm making a reductionist claim. Of course, I mean, again, I am not making a reductionist claim by saying that this is only about Muslims, and I made it clear in the course of my intervention that when I mean Islamophobia and Islam, I said how these scholars again pose and articulate the challenge that seems to be facing liberal democracy today. Again, to be fair to them as well, they don't say that Islam is the only challenge, but they say that Islam is one of the most prominent, or Muslims are the most prominent challenge, attributing to them conditions that they can be assimilated, cultural incompatibility, etc., etc. You are right that there are other communities, and even the Muslims themselves are diverse. I mean, you can't really, attach to Muslims of Pakistan, India, and China, and Turkey, and Saudi Arabia, and Palestine, and Syria, to be, sharing the same type of things. So there are diversity, but I'm just taking, what these thinkers say in their own terms, and trying to see how that kind of claim of Islamophobia works in relation. Actually, this is actually consistent, actually strengthening my claim about these claims being Islamophobic, in the sense that they attach and attribute over generalizations and simplifications of an otherwise very complicated phenomena, in relation to these communities. As to what multiculturalism as an unfinished project and what are the challenges. I mean, again, there is one thing that I think you are right, that I share with you in relation to multiculturalism as a project. Multiculturalism means different things in different contexts, and I'm not entirely sure that every group that benefited or resorted to articulate political claims of inclusion resorted to be reduced only as religious. There are many national minorities that actually were very much deploying and capitalizing on multicultural rights, as ways of trying to claim political inclusion in different countries, So this is not only to be reduced to religion, the Francophones or the Palestinians in Israel or many other groups that really refer to this multicultural discourse were not reduced only to religions. They were, ethnic and, minority national rights that were also very much part of this. Now, what do we do? I really think that this remains a very serious challenge, because multiculturalism came and provided a response to diversity and heterogeneity, and diversity and heterogeneity is there to remain with us. So is it that we try to ignore it and adopt sameness of some sort, which we tried before and we know that it failed, or benigning it, or different kind of techniques that we deploy? I don't think this is the way forward. I think the way forward is really to seriously take diversity as a constitutive human of conditions and make it and politicize it rather than just to depoliticize it. And as for the specificities of Italy, I'm not very familiar with the discussions in Italy, but of course there are different manifestations in different cases in different countries. But I'm not entirely sure that not being Christian doesn't allow an individual to appreciate certain cultural attributes of some sort. It's not an understanding in particular. I think we can understand many things, even if you are not from the same religion. The question that is posed here, to which extent the Italian state, again, I'm not familiar with the Italian politics, is much more towards kind of integrationist politics, where they can negotiate more, kind of things vis-a-vis these immigrants and their backgrounds. And that could be valid also to France, which is much more explicit in terms of the numbers of, ex-colonies in there. And I'm not entirely sure I agree with the way you depict the history of Italy, vis-a-vis its colonial attempts. Even if they failed as a colonial power, I'm not entirely sure that the way they depicted me meaning that they can get away from not seriously addressing many issues in Libya or Eritrea or Ethiopia or the relations with Europe and why. The fact that they failed or they didn't do much, in that doesn't make them not having a very serious colonial legacy. And this worries me because also this is how many, certain amounts of Italian politics tries to get away with Mussolini and with fascism. Not coming to terms with seriously with these legacies in a very archaeological, deep, profounder way is, I think, very problematic in that sense. Again, I think there's a very serious way of trying to negotiate, and trying to confront, and trying to come to terms with these questions. Which my hope is, if they put that in this vein, I think there is a more reasonable chances to see a much more accommodationist notions of citizenship without romanticizing citizenship and attributing to it like a magic word that it doesn't exclude anything and it doesn't, and it doesn't do a magic word.
Ok, intendevo semplicemente dire sulla storia coloniale che non sia importante perché non ci sono stati grandi scambi. Cioè, l'Italia non ha avuto molto dalle colonie in termini culturali, ma la velocità rimangono in conti con la storia, eccetera. Allora, a questo punto direi che se non ci sono altre domande a Bashir, passiamo, non ci sono, e passiamo la parola alla professoressa Melissa Williams. Melissa Williams insegna a Toronto, si è sempre occupata di queste questioni di etica e della democrazia, della teoria della democrazia, e la sua relazione ha come titolo la cittadinanza oltre o la cittadinanza dopo la sovranità.
Molto grazie. Thank you so much, and to the organizers and to all of you who are still here after a very full day of conversation. Okay, so thank you very much to the organizers and to all of you who are still here after a very long day of conversation. I hope that, I thank you for staying with us and hope not to put you to sleep after this long day. Like many of the other panelists, my starting point in this talk is the fact that we, as citizens of Western democracies, most of us, are living through a time of tremendous upheaval in our democratic systems. We've already heard about the crisis of representation that has been building for decades as citizens' trust in parliamentary institutions has declined. As political polarization intensifies and deepens, we find ourselves pitted against one another, against our fellow citizens, those who live in more rural areas against those who live in cities, the somewheres against the anywheres, as David Goodhart puts it, regions that have been hollowed out under globalization and those that have flourished, a predominantly white coalition on the right and a racially diverse coalition on the left. Established political parties of the center are being displaced or reconfigured by new political forces all over the place. Now, many political scientists have been sounding the alarm about the threat that the recent surge of populist nationalism poses to democracy itself, warning that when these parties win control, they are tempted to weaken constitutional limits on majoritarianism, particularly the courts, and to weaken protections for the press, for political opponents, and for ethnic minorities, who are often presented as enemies of the pure people that populists put forth as the true subject of popular sovereignty. As we've seen in Hungary and elsewhere, the threat of populist illiberal democracy to democratic constitutionalism is real, and I believe we should be worried about the security of basic civil and political rights for minorities, even where direct assaults on democratic institutions have not yet been launched. But the purpose of my remarks today is actually not to add my voice to the chorus of alarm over rising populism. I hope that what I'll say will be at least a little bit controversial. Because I want to say that although populism does pose a danger for democracy, I still harbor some shred of that are most important to citizens in their lived daily experience. Now, in using the word embedded, I need to invoke Karl Polanyi's famous book, The Great Transformation, which a lot of scholars these days have recently been returning to as a source of insight for our times. The book takes a grand historical sweep through the history of capitalism in order to make sense of the rise of fascism between the two world wars. As many of you know, Polanyi's core thesis is that the rise of market society depends upon the disembedding of economic relationships from other social relationships based on kinship, tradition, and locale. Market growth depends on the commodification, he says, of things that never were commodities before. It needs labor to be mobile so that it can be put to work wherever the production of market goods is happening. It needs land to be saleable so that it can be developed for the production of market goods by whoever has the resources to put land to the most productive use. So the commodification of labor and the privatization of land, though, is massively disruptive to social relationships. And Polanyi shows that the growth of market society was by no means a smooth or linear process. Rather, he traces what he calls a dialectic, a double movement, which can, and here I'm quoting from Polanyi, can be personified as the action of two organizing principles in society, each of them setting itself specific institutional aims, having the support of definite social forces, and using its own distinctive methods, end quote. These two principles are economic liberalism, which aims at the self-regulating market and is supported by the trading and financial classes, and the principle of social protection, which aims at the conservation of human well-being and of nature, and was historically supported by the working and landed classes, who sought protecting legislation to limit and regulate the market. So to make Polanyi's long story short, in the interwar period, he argues, these contending forces had become entrenched in parliamentary governments, producing both economic and political paralysis. Fascism presented itself as the solution to this paralysis, just as populism presents itself today as the solution to the political stasis of our own time. Then, as now, neither liberal paralysis nor the solution to it were confined to one country. As Polanyi wrote, quote, there was no type of background of religious, cultural, or national tradition that made a country immune to fascism once the conditions for its emergence were given, end quote. So on Polanyi's account, fascism arose as a reaction of society to protect itself against the great disembedding of the economy wrought by the rise of market society in the 19th century. Of course, I'm grossly oversimplifying a rich and sophisticated and complex story. But I think that Polanyi is very relevant to us today because we are at a turning point in another double movement. The consequence of abandoning the post-war Bretton Woods solution to the dual crisis of market crash and fascism, namely what John Ruggie has called, following Polanyi, embedded liberalism, in which the free market was tempered by representative democracy and the welfare state. And that order, of course, was undone by what many now call the neoliberal order ushered in by Reagan and Thatcher, the liberalization of trade, the deregulation of finance, and the attempt to dismantle the welfare state, all in a renewed quest to create a self-regulating market under the mantle of freedom. So this neoliberal era brought a disruption of social relations on a scale I think that we really have not seen since the Second World War. Embedded liberalism at the scale of the nation-state gave way to new institutions of supranational governance to regulate finance and trade. It also gave rise to massive increases in international trade that shifted manufacturing from the older industrial societies of Europe and North America to China and India and Mexico and other countries in what we hitherto had been thinking about as the developing world or the global south. Further, the deregulation of finance, which was crucial to this moment in capitalism, it still is, made it more difficult for states to capture the gains from trade. So all of the wealth that this liberalization of trade was generating, makes it more difficult for states to capture that wealth for public projects, including both infrastructure and social welfare. Crucially, as Branko Milanovic has shown, among others studying inequality, of course, PKT, but as Milanovic shows in his 2016 book, Global Inequality, these gains flowed, the gains from trade flowed to an ever-narrowing segment of the now global super-rich, the 1% or the 0.1% or the 0.01%, first of all, and secondly, to the lower income segments of the developing countries that have been able to join the global market for manufactured goods, but leaving behind the traditional working and middle classes of Western democracies whose income and wealth have stagnated or declined in this period, the last 30 to 40 years. So globalization has also brought a significant increase in addition to inequality and the creation of new structures of governance. It's also brought a significant increase, of course, in human migration around the world. It's one factor in the rise of immigration into many Western democracies over recent decades. I think it's also another source of the disruption of society is migration. Another is, I think it's important to bear in mind that the economic globalization, which is fueled by carbon energy, is also changing our planet through global warming, which will, over time, also add pressures to migration while doing irreparable damage to our ecosystems and to other species. So, taken together, globalization has created a system of international interdependence that's prone to crisis. It's prone to crises of migration, environmental crises, and economic crises, such as we saw in 2008. And for most ordinary citizens, these really large transformations in our social orders feel like a juggernaut or like a runaway train. A force in which we are inescapably caught up, but over which we have no sense of real control. And all the while, political elites across the ideological spectrum have been chanting the Thatcherite mantra. There is no alternative to deregulated markets in order to maintain international competitiveness in a global economy. So these transformations, I think, these massive transformations help to make sense of the paradox that the rise of populist nationalism, and it's a virulent kind of nationalism, is a transnational phenomenon. Political scientists have formed two camps, broadly speaking, in trying to make sense of this paradox. Some ascribe rising populism to economic anxieties of the traditional white working industrial classes whose futures have been hollowed out as a consequence of economic globalization and rising economic inequality. Others attribute populism to a different feature of globalization, namely increasing population migration and especially, as well as social changes wrought by egalitarian movements against racism and sexism. And so they point to rising cultural anxieties as the most important causal factor driving populist nationalism as a transnational phenomenon. Now, to my mind, the most convincing explanations are actually a hybrid of these, or intersectional in their analysis. That is, they take into account both the economic and the cultural dynamics here in generating status anxieties among the traditional white, male, working, and middle classes. So the supporters of populist movements are not the worst off economically in their societies. They're the lower middle and middle income groups within the majority white population, and they are disproportionately male. So if we're focusing on this class and thinking about it in status terms, I think it makes sense to understand what's going on relative social status over these years of neoliberal globalization for this particular class. The first is that they have lost social status relative to the best off members of society, the super wealthy. Because as the gains from trade flow to an ever narrowing segment of the wealthy few, the traditional working and middle class faces a declining prospect of upward social mobility for themselves and for their children. And so whereas it used to be the case that people had some aspiration of social mobility, now the gap has grown so long and grown so large that those aspirations now ring increasingly hollow. So that's the first status loss. The second, I think they've lost status relative to the worst off segments of society, in which women and racialized minorities are overrepresented. So as barriers to women's and minorities' participation in the economy have been somewhat eroded, they have been able to take advantage of new opportunities in a changing economy. So there is still a gender gap, there's still a racial gap in income and wealth, but a growing number of women and minorities have been able to make their way into the middle class and even into the upper tiers of status and wealth that appear increasingly inaccessible to middle income, traditional working class whites. The third prong of the relative status loss, I think, is that because this class identifies itself with the nation as a whole, they've suffered a relative status loss as their countries lose relative economic power as compared in the global economy, as compared with the rising power of countries such as China and India, and for the US, the Mexican case is also highly relevant. And so then there's a loss in identity connected to the relative loss in economic power of one's country in the global economy. So I think populist movements, have emerged as new political entrepreneurs mobilize these status anxieties to paint a portrait of establishment political elites as having failed to protect the real people from the forces arrayed against them. And the key difference of populists of the left and those of the right lies in how they identify the threats to the interests of the people. So the right depicts the people as a racially homogeneous nation and targets immigrants, minorities, and foreign countries together with the so-called globalist elites who favor free trade as their enemies. And the left has a more racially inclusive view of the people, the 99%, as the Occupy movement put it, and targets the super rich and their influence over policy as the true danger to the people's interests. So let me now return to my thesis, which is that the lesson that we Democrats can learn from populist nationalists, the populists of the right, is that democracy needs to be embedded in the social relationships that matter most to citizens in their lived daily experience. And to see this, I think we need to understand the current populist moment as the second phase of a different kind of double movement from the one Polanyi diagnosed. A double movement of democratic reaction to the global financial crisis and more generally to the disruptive social consequences of economic globalization. So I think the first moment in this dialectic of democracy came in the immediate aftermath of the financial crisis, crystallizing in the Occupy movement in the US and globally, and in the movements of indignant citizens in Southern Europe. In this democratic reaction of the left, anger over social precarity and runaway inequality was addressed to the global financial elite as represented by Wall Street and by the European Central Bank and by the Troika, more generally. I think what's interesting about these movements in part is that they matched the structure of their resistance to the structure of the financial power they were struggling against. They were transnational, networked, horizontal, decentered, or leaderless. And here I think there's an interesting connection to the kind of diasporic structure of these movements. I want to link that back to Julie Cooper's talk earlier, because I think you're an to pursue there. But the movement's encampments in public squares across North America and Europe and around the globe, where I think we can think of them as kind of democratic archipelagos, islands of democratic spirit, separated by geographic space, but linked in their imagination by a subsurface structure, the structure of global financial capitalism that they jointly opposed through their synchronized and coordinated protest movements. Of course, social media played a crucial role in making this possible, as it continues to make translocal protest movements, to enable translocal protest movements that have adopted a similar kind of structure, from the global climate movement to the Women's March. It's not that transnational movements are new with Occupy, but that new technologies make it easier to mobilize these scale-shifting, and here I'm invoking the work of Sidney Tarrow and Adam, the social movement theorists, so a scale-shifting political imagination that transnational movements need, and that's easier with social media than it is in earlier times. That's the capacity to use local action to address a power structure that crosses borders, whether it's the slave trade targeted by the transnational abolitionist movement in the 19th century or global financial capitalism in the 21st century. But the lesson of these movements is that when economic and political power structures are networked across borders, democracy too must be networked. The movements that formed in the immediate wake of the global financial crisis were, I think, anti-system movements, by and large. They were formations of democracy, you might say democracy against sovereignty, in the sense that they viewed the institutions of the state, including the electoral system, as too captured by economic interests to be worth engaging as citizens. These were movements in what Jane Mansbridge calls the deep resistance tradition of democratic theory and democratic action, that is rising up to oppose the long train of abuses brought by tyrannical power, here the power of the market over ordinary people's lives. But like the system they were opposing, these movements were, I think, disembedded in Polanyi's terms, because they saw established electoral institutions at the national scale as suspect. They turned away from these practices of democracy that were most familiar to citizens' everyday experience, and instead formed potent, very potent, but still ephemeral connections in public squares and social media, connections that were not tethered to ordinary life by local face-to-face interactions or regular interactions in the workplace or any other already institutionalized setting. Some of these movements then later became institutionalized, such as Podemos in Spain, Syriza in Greece, and I think it's also really important to acknowledge that the movements for minimum wage increases, which have continued to be organized transnationally and translocally, and have had a lot of success, actually, owe their origins to this moment of democratic reaction against in response to the global financial crisis. But still, these movements, as transnational networks that are mobilized in the name of we the 99%, they dissipated. So I think we're now in the second moment of this double movement of democratic reaction to globalization, and this moment of populist nationalism. And it has many, many dark sides, including racism, xenophobia, and virulent anti-feminism. Their picture of the people is monochromatic and robustly exclusionary, and for that reason, many have understandably rejected these movements as anti-democratic, and I tend to be sympathetic to that rejection. But I do think there is something else going on in the populist movements that small d Democrats should be paying attention to, and that is that they are reclaiming the state in the name of the people, the demos. This is democracy for sovereignty. The popular sovereignty of the people, now the people understood problematically as unitarian and pure, but still determined to wrest power away from establishment political elites who fail to protect society from the disruptions of globalization. And these movements are deeply rooted in identity, in real or imagined kinship symbolic and emotional register of political life at the national scale, but they are also embedded in long-established democratic institutions and practices. And I think this is one reason why they have been so successful in reclaiming the state from so-called globalist elites. I think they can readily organize themselves through the democratic institutions that are already ready to hand within the state. And because states have some control, quite a lot of control over immigration and a little bit less control, but still some control over trade, it's a relatively easy matter for political entrepreneurs to mobilize those status anxieties that I was talking about earlier and target them toward these issues and to get these citizens to participate again in political institutions by fixing attention on those issues. Now, as I've said, I agree with the analysts who think these movements place democracy in a very dangerous moment. Yet, if our democratic constitutions hold and their limits on majoritarian rule remain intact, it's a big if, then the moment's re-embedding of democratic action in durable social relationships that are meaningful and important to citizens might be laying the groundwork for a revitalization of democracy at the national scale. And in some places, as both Miracle mentioned this morning, voter turnout is picking up across the ideological spectrum in some places, in some recent elections. So there's some reason to think that this could be a positive trend. And if it does take hold, then citizens reclaiming of the most consequential democratic institutions they have, electoral institutions at the level of the state, may reinvent democratic action in the social relationships that actually matter most and are most meaningful to most citizens. And these are always, I think, mostly local relationships, ties close to home, whether home is the city or whether it's the countryside. Now, we shouldn't be too hopeful too soon, because reclaiming democracy at the national scale is very unlikely to be capable of addressing the immense social disruptions wrought by globalization, because these have causes that cross borders. Other panelists have addressed this theme and present collective action problems. Global tax evasion, rampant inequality, climate change, that states acting as autonomous sovereign entities simply cannot solve alone. If these collective action problems are to be solved democratically rather than technocratically, they require action by ordinary citizens acting together across borders, putting pressure simultaneously on their national governments to get to the table and negotiate international agreements, as well as on suprastate institutions that have some capacity to address the problem in question. So if democracy is to survive the challenges of our age, I want to suggest that maybe it has to be democracy after sovereignty, a form of democracy that acknowledges that the problems we confront cannot be contained within the borders of territorial sovereign states, and that the political elites of those states cannot be relied upon to address those problems without sustained pressure from below, coordinated across borders by citizens acting both locally and transnationally. So I think the lesson of Occupy and the Indignados movements remains valid, that where problems confronting democratic citizens degrees cross borders, then democracy too must be networked across borders. Yet most citizens will not become politically engaged in democratic actions that are disconnected from the social relations that matter most to them. And so I think the lessons of populist nationalists also remain valid, namely that democracy to be vital has to be embedded in this relationship, symbols and meanings that hold salience for citizens. So I think democracy's dialectical double movement in response to the human failures of globalization, the disembedding of democratic action through transnational movements first, and then the re-embedding of democracy in the nation state, needs a kind of Aufhebung, a synthesis, if democracy is not to succumb to either the authoritarian ambitions of populist leaders or to the technocratic rule of global elites. So So we need to enrich our imagination of the possibilities of embedded, transnational, democratic action. And I think this form of democratic imaginary already exists in the practices of several real-world transnational movements. It exists in the transnational climate movement, as I've already suggested, and particularly in the Climate Action Network, which links groups of citizens who organize locally in 120 countries around the world to advance policies at the local, national, regional, and global levels that will address climate change. It also exists in a movement that I've been learning more about, La Via Campesina, a transnational peasants movement that aims at protecting the land from destructive economic development and achieving what they call food sovereignty for local and national populations over their systems of food production and distribution. I won't be able to say more about that movement, but I think that these and many other movements are embedded in the sense that they begin from local face-to-face social relationships, but situate their local actions in relation to a narrative, a story, about structural problems that cannot be solved through local or state-level action alone. They have formed translocal networks of communication through which they develop strategies and tactics for addressing problems through multi-scalar or scale-shifting, scale-jumping, coordinated actions, sometimes directed at local policymakers, sometimes at policymakers within the state, sometimes at supranational institutions. And so in these movements, and citizens, this is the kind of imagination that they embody, that they exhibit, that they perform. They're shapeshifters. They see their actions as simultaneously local, national, transnational, and are incapable of redirecting their action to the scale of politics that, in their judgment, is most salient at a particular political moment. And so they are able to respond to new opportunities and new threats in an ever-changing political environment at their best. You know, this is not all the time that they're able to muster this kind of scale-shifting energy, but it happens occasionally. It is not impossible. And so what enables these movements to endure and to bring about real change when they do, which is not always, is, I think, the fact that they are embedded in social relationships that are themselves durable and meaningful to the citizens who belong to them. And I think that means, above all, that they're embedded in local relationships and they scale up from there. So what remains uncertain is whether this local scale-shifting structure of democratic action can be embedded in the electoral institutions of parliamentary democracy, whether at the national or the regional scale, and this has not yet happened. It hasn't happened at a transnational scale, but I think there are some signs of possibility in the emergence of translocal democratic organizing within national electoral processes that we are seeing now emerge. In the United States, we're seeing it take form, in particular in the Trump resistance movements, which have adopted the tactics of the conservative Tea Party movement that formed in the wake of the global financial crisis, the bank bailouts, and in resistance to Obama's presidency. Now the left has taken some lessons from the Tea Party movement of the right and has formed thousands of new local groups of citizens, really thousands, across the country, working in loosely coordinated networks to elect progressive candidates at every scale of politics, from the local school board to the city council, to the county government, to the state, to the House of Representatives, to the state, to the Senate, and eventually they claim the presidency in 2020. These groups, many of which have adopted the banner of the indivisible movement, focus first and foremost on building relationships at the local level, interacting with other citizens face-to-face, going door-to-door, meeting in public squares and farmers markets and shopping centers and so on. So this is a form of local participatory grassroots democracy, which is driven less by a common ideology than a sense of urgency about reclaiming the democratic institutions citizens have before it's too late. So the question is, can translocal citizens movements embedded in the existing institutions of electoral democracy become transnational movements as well? I think it's not impossible, but it remains to be seen. We're certainly seeing transnational networks of populist parties already forming on the right, organized not through grassroots mobilization of local groups of citizens, but through the joint strategizing of charismatic populist leaders and their champions, like Steve Bannon, who claim the authority to speak in the name of the real people against the globalist elites. Ironically, it's only the Eurosceptic parties that are well coordinated at the European level. And so only very recently have we begun to see the glimmer of similar aspiration to transnational coordination among political leaders on the left. And I can refer you to Bernie Sanders gave a speech at SAIS just a few weeks ago in which he calls for a global movement for democracy. So I think we're starting to see some sparks on the left, but they're still few and far between, and there's definitely no flame yet. So democracy is in a dangerous moment, but to the extent that our democratic institutions hold, I want to suggest, again, holding out some little small shred of optimism in an otherwise dark time, then citizens, if citizens robustly reclaim the democratic institutions they still have, locally, nationally, and maybe eventually transnationally, then there is still hope that this populist moment of re-embedding democratic agency in existing democratic institutions and in citizens' core relationships might help us to revitalize democracy at every scale. So if we like this idea of a sort of embedded transnational democratic action, though, we have to bear in mind that all the while, inequality continues to grow, the planet continues to warm, and the right continues to strengthen. So how much time there is to organize such democratic action, I think, is very much in question. Thank you.
C'è una strategia di resistenza, quello che lei ha detto, no? Siamo stati sempre molto, siamo stati qui per questi giorni a piangere sulla fine della democrazia, abbiamo un minimo di strategia. Se ci sono domande, commenti, annotazioni, contestazioni, questo è il momento, se no ci scioglieremo. Sì, prego, c'è qualcuno con il microfono? C'è. No, c'è Julie Cooper che voleva fare una domanda, ma se no, so just come here.
I wanted to invite you to talk more about the place of the state in this transnational coalition that you were trying to build, because I take it that one of your plans was that the productive insight of right-wing populism that the left needs to think about is their move to reclaim the state in the name of the people, and to romance the state in a certain way, that the left too needs to reclaim the state and create a romance surrounding the state and its institutions. But my question is that part of the way that the right-wing populism reclaims the state in the name of the people is precisely by attacking institutions like the courts, which are unelected. And in your manifesto at the end, you spoke about reinvigorating electoral democracy, but it seems to me that if the left is going to make a counter move of reclaiming the state, part of what the left needs to do is precisely to explain the role of unelected institutions like courts, like the free press, in democracy. And I'm wondering if you have any thoughts about how to do that, precisely because we're not talking there about elections or direct democracy, but institutions that do feel very far removed from people and their everyday lives.
Okay, thanks, Julie. Thanks, Julie. I think this state remains very important in how we think about democracy, even if we're trying to think about democracy transnationally. And that's partly because it's at the level of the state where our most robust democratic empowerments are currently institutionalized. I don't think we should sacralize the state. Maybe eventually we'll figure out a way of protecting democratic empowerments at other scales that are robust, and we might eventually be able to let go of the state as the centerpiece of democratic action. But I think we're not there yet, and at this moment brings home how much we're not there. But the idea that democratic politics needs counter-majoritarian institutions in order to be stable and secure is a familiar idea in the history of constitutional democracy, the theory of constitutional democracy, and the importance of the courts in protecting democratic freedoms and equal access to democratic citizenship is more than amply demonstrated by what we're seeing in Hungary in particular, and now with court packing in the United States. The courts are one of the very first targets of authoritarians and of sites of de-democratization. So we do need those counter-authoritarian institutions. I think that's clear.
Io credo che a questo punto possiamo chiudere.